Introduction. Welcome to a deep, quiet journey through the daily lives, dreams, struggles, and rituals of medieval women. This documentary is not about queens and saints alone, but about the millions of women whose stories were lived in silence, on farms, in city alleys, in dark stone kitchens and sunlit convents. You may drift off as we go, and that is fine. Their stories will wait. Chapter 1. Born to a Role. The start of a woman's life. 1.1. Birth and early childhood. The birth of a girl was both celebrated and quietly mourned in some homes. While boys promised future strength and inheritance, girls were seen as caretakers and future wives. Midwives attended births, often with few tools besides cloth, hot water, and herbal brews. A girl's health at birth could determine her worth in the eyes of the village. If she survived infancy, she became a part of her mother's daily shadow. From her earliest days, she was taught silence, stillness, and usefulness. Her world was the floor of the house, her mother's skirts, and the rhythm of domestic life. Dolls made of rags, carved animals, and songs sung during work were her earliest teachers. 1.2 Naming, godparents, and first blessings. A girl's name was often chosen from saints or family ancestors. Baptism took place quickly after birth, especially with high infant mortality. Godparents were not only spiritual guides, but also witnesses, tasked with moral guidance. The priest's blessing marked her not as an individual, but as part of a larger order of obedience and faith. Amulets were tied to her crib, crosses hung nearby. She was expected to grow into modesty, patience, and prayer. From the beginning, her life was woven with expectation and quiet limitation. 1.3. The value of a daughter, hope and limitation. A daughter might one day bring a dowry, nurse a parent in old age, or care for siblings, yet she also represented a financial burden. Feeding her, clothing her, and eventually marrying her off. These were constant concerns. Still, many fathers loved their daughters deeply, and many mothers saw in them a continuation of themselves. Girls inherited lullabies, weaving techniques, stories of saints, and warnings about the world. These were her first lessons in survival. In the heart of the bustling city of Cairo, amidst the labyrinthine alleys and vibrant bazaars of old Cairo, there lived a young girl named Aisha. Life for Aisha was a tapestry woven with threads of tradition, religion, and societal norms. Her days were filled with a myriad of tasks, and her evenings echoed with the tales of her ancestors. At every turn, she was learning the intricate dance of womanhood in a society where a girl's value was often measured by her domestic skills and adherence to religious customs. But what did it mean to be a woman in this world? What were the unwritten rules that governed her life? And how did she navigate the expectations placed upon her? To answer these questions, we must delve into the rich cultural context of Old Cairo and explore the various ways in which Aisha and countless other girls like her learned the skills and knowledge necessary to thrive in their society. One of the most significant aspects of a girl's upbringing was the emphasis on observation and imitation. From a young age, girls were expected to be attentive to the world around them and to learn by watching the women who came before them. For instance, Aisha would have spent countless hours observing her mother and other female members of her household as they went about their daily tasks. She would have seen how her mother cleaned the house, folded clothes, served food, and interacted with guests. Each of these actions was a lesson in itself, a demonstration of how a good and dutiful woman should conduct herself. Similarly, she would have watched how the women in her community prayed, dressed, and even walked, and she would have emulated their behavior. This method of learning was not just practical, it was also a way to instill values and norms. By seeing their mothers and other female role models perform certain tasks or observe certain rituals, girls internalized the importance of these activities and understood their significance within their culture. It was a silent but powerful form of instruction that ensured the continuation of traditions from one generation to the next. However, observation and imitation were only the beginning. Learning womanhood was a multifaceted process that involved a wide range of skills and instruction. Let's see some more. Girls were not just expected to master domestic tasks, they were also responsible for understanding and adhering to a strict set of religious and moral guidelines. Their world was one where every action was carefully scrutinized and judged based on the standards of their faith and societal norms. At an early age, they were taught the tenets of their religion, the stories of their prophets, and the laws that governed their daily lives. They learned to pray, fast, and behave in a manner that was deemed proper and modest. For example, Aisha would have been taught the correct way to drape her clothing, to lower her gaze when in the presence of men, and to speak in a soft and respectful tone. These were not just rules, they were the very foundation of her identity as a Muslim woman. Any deviation could bring shame not just to herself, but to her entire family. So girls were not just observers, they were active participants in religious practices. They attended prayers, observed rituals, and listened to religious teachings. It was through these experiences that they internalized the values and beliefs that shaped their worldview. Moreover, they were also taught to be charitable, kind, and pious, qualities that were highly valued in their society. They were encouraged to help the needy, to be honest and truthful, and to lead a life free from sin. Failure to uphold these standards could result in severe consequences, both in terms of social standing and religious salvation. Another crucial aspect of a girl's education was the emphasis on acquiring skills that were considered essential for their role in society. This ranged from basic domestic tasks to specialized skills that were specific to certain trades or professions. For instance, Aisha would have been taught how to cook, clean, and take care of the household in general. These were not seen as chores, but as fundamental skills that would be critical to her future role as a wife and mother. She would also have learned skills related to child rearing, such as how to breastfeed, bathe, and clothe infants, as well as how to teach them basic manners and morals. These skills were vital because children were not merely seen as miniature adults, but as the future bearers of the family's legacy. Additionally, depending on her family's socioeconomic status, Aisha might have also learned skills such as weaving, embroidery, or henna application. These not only served as a source of income, but also as a means of expressing creativity within the confines of her domestic role. Furthermore, in a society where literacy was not necessarily widespread, girls were often taught to memorize verses from the Quran. This not only served as a form of religious instruction, but also as a testament to their piety and devotion. Being able to recite the Quran was highly regarded and could even be a source of prestige for the family. Moreover, girls were also taught to be proficient in household accounts, managing resources, and planning ahead. This was essential not just for economic reasons, but also to ensure the smooth functioning of the household. They learned to balance the needs of the family with limited resources, make informed decisions, and plan ahead. These skills were not only practical, but also reflected a sense of responsibility and maturity that was valued in their society. Despite the seriousness of much of the instruction, there were also lighter aspects to a girl's upbringing. They engaged in games, songs, and rhymes that were not only fun, but also carried hidden meanings and lessons. For example, while performing certain chores or engaging in household work, girls often sang songs that contained verses related to their tasks. These songs were not just a way to pass the time, but also a form of entertainment and education. They might have sung songs about household duties, praising important figures, or even teaching younger girls about their culture and history. Similarly, they might have engaged in clapping games or other interactive activities that reinforced concepts they had learned through other forms of instruction. These games made learning enjoyable and memorable, ensuring that the lessons stuck with the girls as they grew older. Moreover, storytelling was an integral part of girls' lives. During evenings spent in the company of other women, they would have listened to tales not just of adventure, but also of moral lessons and historical events. These stories were often accompanied by discussions and debates, encouraging critical thinking and the formation of opinions. Such gatherings not only provided entertainment, but also served as a platform for passing down cultural heritage and values. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of a girl's learning experience was the fact that it occurred primarily within the home and in the company of other women. This was not just a reflection of the societal norms of the time, but also a deliberate strategy to ensure the preservation of traditions and values. By keeping girls away from the influences of the outside world, they could be molded into the kind of women that their society demanded. Moreover, it also created a strong bond among the women in the family and the community. The shared responsibility of teaching and learning not only brought them closer together, but also ensured the continuity of their traditions. In conclusion, Aisha's journey of learning womanhood in Old Cairo was a testament to the resilience, adaptability, and resourcefulness of women in a patriarchal society. Through observation, imitation, religious instruction, skill acquisition, and participation in cultural activities, she and countless girls like her were not just learning the domestic arts, they were mastering the very essence of what it meant to be a woman in their world. Their lives were a blend of tradition and change, where they navigated the expectations of their society while also carving out their own paths. Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button below the video and share it with your friends. Your support means a lot to us and motivates us to keep creating quality content. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll be joining a community of learners who are as passionate about history as you are. We've got lots of exciting content coming up, and we want you to be a part of it. Thank you for watching. Chapter 3, In the Home, the Heart of Her World. 3.1 Daily Chores, an Invisible Labor. The medieval home was a world of endless repetition. Women swept hearths, ground grain, churned butter, mended linens, and scoured pots. Much of this labor went unrecorded and unpraised, but it formed the silent engine of society. The rhythm was relentless. Feed the animals, tend the fire, prepare meals, spin, wash, repeat. Even illness or pregnancy rarely stopped the flow. To rest was to fall behind. 3.2 Meals, fire, and the sacred hearth. The hearth was the soul of the house. Women coaxed it to life each morning and guarded its embers through the night. Around it, meals were prepared and life unfolded. Food was often modest: barley bread, broth, porridge, onions, and beans. But on feast days, women coordinated elaborate spreads with meats, spiced pies, and ale. Recipes were passed by memory, not paper. A well-fed home was a source of feminine pride. The hearth also held symbolic weight. It was where stories were shared, songs sung, and family gathered for warmth and light. 3.3 Mother-daughter relationships. Mothers were the first teachers. They passed on not only skills, but ways of being. When to lower one's eyes, how to navigate marriage, how to grieve without collapsing. These relationships were often tender, but also bound by duty. Discipline was common, especially in households under pressure. Daughters might be corrected harshly, but they were also protected fiercely. In many homes, the mother was the emotional center, both comforter and enforcer. Her mood shaped the day. Her absence, temporary or final, left an unmistakable void. You've heard it said, "A jack of all trades is a master of none." But for the women of the 14th century, being good at many things was essential to survival. They had to spin, weave, dye yarn, and mend fabrics. And if they were good at it, their products would sell in the marketplace, bringing much-needed money into their households. What did life look like for these women? Let's find out. Hi, and welcome to Life in the Middle Ages. Today we will explore how women learned their textile skills. Give this a thumbs up and subscribe so you won't miss out on our latest episodes. From childhood, girls were taught to transform raw wool or flax into usable thread. It was a painstaking process that took hours of patient work to produce just a single spool of thread. First, the fibers had to be carded, which meant removing twigs, leaves, and other debris from the gathered plants. The carded material was then placed between rollers to align the fibers before twisting them together to form a rope-like strand. This was the initial step in the creation of textiles that would become clothing for the family. Mastering the spinning wheel was the next challenge. This device used a combination of hand power and gravity to draw out and spin the fibers into thread. The spinner would start by attaching the fibers to the wheel and then use their feet to start the wheel spinning. As the wheel turned, they drew out the fibers, creating a continuous thread. If they were learning the craft, they would sit with an adult as they spun and would imitate their actions. Since each region specialized in certain types of textiles, the young learner would also be copying the techniques specific to their area. Once the thread was completed, it was ready to be dyed. Natural materials such as plants, berries, and minerals were used to create different colors. The choice of color would depend on the intended use of the finished product and the season of the year. After the material had been soaked in the dye bath, it was rinsed and dried, and then it was ready for the final stage of production, weaving. In order to turn the thread into cloth, a loom was set up. A vertical frame held the lengthwise threads, called the warp, in place, while the weaver used a shuttle to pass the crosswise threads, called the weft, between the warp threads. A simple hand loom could be made from readily available materials, such as 2 sticks and some cord. However, a heavier duty frame loom would last longer and make a better quality fabric. Looms varied in size depending on their location and purpose. A large merchant loom could be over 6 feet wide, while a woman making cloth at home would likely have a smaller loom, maybe about 3 feet wide. Most of the weaving was done by hand, although some communities might use treadles to speed up the process. Treadles are hinged boards that lift the warped threads off the ground to allow the weaver to concentrate on weaving the pattern without having to press down on the threads with their foot. The design of the cloth depended on the weaver's skill and the type of material being used. Some weavers produced patterned cloth by using threads of different colors. Others wove sturdy, plain cloth that would be used for blankets and curtains. When the piece was finished, it was taken off the loom and allowed to settle. Any loose threads were trimmed, and the edges were finished to prevent unraveling. The last step was ironing, which was done with a flat stone that was heated in a fire and then run across the cloth. As you can imagine, each of these steps required a great deal of skill to master. No wonder the women of the time were so good at it. Textiles were not luxuries, they were survival. While the wealthiest people of the time could afford to purchase new garments when their old ones wore out, most people did not have that luxury. Therefore, every woman was expected to know how to mend, patch, and darn holes in their family's clothing. It was common for a woman to carry a kit with her when she left the house that contained sewing supplies, a spare length of fabric for patching, and even a small portable loom for weaving in repairs. Given the importance of textiles, it's surprising how little record there is of the women who produced them. We know that weaving was an important part of the economy because historians have found documents that refer to the Guild of Weavers in towns like Paris and London. However, records of individual women, spinners, dyers, and weavers are extremely rare. One reason for this is that most of the textile production took place in private homes rather than in factories or workshops. Another reason is that women were often not paid for their work. In many cases, their textile production was a way to supplement the income of their families rather than a source of income for themselves. However, there are a few records that do tell us about the lives of medieval women who made textiles. Parish records sometimes noted the names of women who were paid to embroider vestments for the church, while tax records mentioned those who sold cloth in the marketplace. Even though these records are incomplete, they do give us some insight into the lives of medieval women who made textiles. They also show us that despite the fact that their work was not always valued or recognized, these women played an important role in the economy and the community. Some women wove or knitted prayer mats or other devotional items to help support their spiritual lives. For others, textiles became a kind of art form. They wove intricate patterns and designs into their cloth, each stitch a form of self-expression. Still others used textiles as a way to connect with their heritage. They learned traditional patterns and techniques from their mothers and grandmothers, keeping alive the cultural traditions of their ancestors. In every stitch, there was a story waiting to be told. Now let's take a closer look at the tools these women used. A spindle and distaff were the earliest tools used for spinning thread. A spindle is a simple device consisting of a stick with a tapered point at one end and a notch near the top. The fibers were placed in the notch, and then the spindle was whirled around. The force of the spinning caused the fibers to twist together and form thread. A distaff is a tool used to hold the fibers in place while they are being spun. It is essentially a stick with a hook on one end and a notch on the other. The fibers are attached to the hook, and then the spindle is held in the hand and whirled around. As the spindle turns, the fibers unwind from the distaff and are drawn out into a thin thread. This method of spinning is still used today in many parts of the world. The spinning wheel was invented in the Middle East around the 5th century BC and was brought to Europe by the Moors in the 8th century. It consists of a wheel, axle, and a seat. The fibers are attached to the axle, and then the wheel is turned. As the wheel turns, the axle rotates, and the fibers are drawn out and twisted together. A spinning wheel could produce thread much faster than a spindle and distaff, so it was an important innovation in textile production. These tools were used by women all over the world, and they were an important part of women's lives in the Middle Ages. Spinning and weaving were not just jobs for these women, they were a way of life. They used these tools to create textiles for their families and their communities, and they passed down their skills to the next generation of women. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights in armor, jousting in a tournament, or perhaps a peasant working in a field. But what about the women of the Middle Ages? What did their day-to-day lives look like? How did they contribute to society? What kinds of challenges did they face? For the women of this time period, life was very different than it is today. They had very few rights and were expected to live their lives subordinate to men. But despite these challenges, they made significant contributions to medieval life. Women of all social classes participated in textile production, from spinning and weaving cloth to embroidering tapestries. This work was not only essential for the survival of their families, but also for the economy of their communities. Whether working in a guild or in the home, medieval women were key contributors to the production of textiles that were used for clothing, decoration, and trade. Alewives produced a wide variety of goods, including beer, bread, cheese, and textiles. They were responsible for managing the household and ensuring that there was food and supplies for their families. In addition to their domestic duties, alewives also produced textiles for sale. They may have spun and woven cloth, embroidered items, or made other textile-related goods. These items were then sold in the market, providing an important source of income for the household. In some cases, alewives were able to build up a small business from their textile production. For example, some alewives may have employed other women to help with their work, such as spinners or weavers. In this way, they were able to generate enough income to support themselves and their families and even employ others. Thanks for joining us today. What are your thoughts on the lives of these women? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. And don't forget to give this a thumbs up and subscribe so you won't miss out on our latest episodes. We'll see you next time. Bye. Marriages made by others. Few women married for love. Marriages were alliances between families, estates, and social classes. Fathers, uncles, and sometimes lords arranged matches based on dowries, land, and honor. A girl might be betrothed at 7 and married at 12, with little say in the matter. Negotiations could take months. Documents were drawn up, witnesses called. The woman's body and future became bargaining points in the presence of ink and seals. Dowries, contracts, and exchanges. A dowry was more than money. It was her entry ticket into another family. It could include land, livestock, clothing, jewelry, or a chest of linen. Without it, many women could not marry at all. Marriage contracts outlined responsibilities, property, and inheritance. Widows might reclaim their dowries. But often, once married, a woman's wealth became her husband's to manage. Coverture erased her legal independence. Still, dowries gave some women leverage, especially in merchant and noble circles. A generous dowry could elevate a family. A missing one could ruin a match. The wedding day, ritual and reality. Weddings were both sacred and communal. Some took place quietly in churches, others unfolded with parades, dancing, and feasting. The bride might wear a new gown, but more often a repurposed dress with fresh trim. Symbolic gestures were key: joining of hands, blessing of rings, binding with ribbons. Afterward, the couple was led to their chamber, often in public view. The consummation confirmed the bond. Behind the music and laughter was tension. A girl left behind her mother, her home, and often her name. She entered a world she had only imagined, where her new role as wife, obedient, fertile, and loyal, would define her existence. It started with a missed cycle, perhaps, or a heaviness in her limbs, suddenly swollen. Maybe a craving that surprised her, like an animal crossing her path, a spider crawling up her sleeve, or a swarm of bees buzzing in her ear. These were some of the first signs, sometimes dreams, oceans, rivers, waterfalls tumbling over her body, washing her clean. Or animals, birds, fish, reptiles, horses, elephants. These could be omens too, portents of what she carried. Women noticed early. Some wept, others prayed. For some it was celebration, for others quiet fear. The first stirrings within, the earliest guesses and hopes, and then the confirmation. A tiny heartbeat under the ribs, 2 lines on a stick, or just the undeniable swell of life beneath the skin. The promise of new life, the terror of life unfurling, the burden and the blessing. Joy and fear intertwined, the miracle and the gamble, a secret shared between her and the sky. In this moment of potential, before movement confirmed the miracle, superstition ruled. An anxious mother could mark her child with a birth defect. Eclipses could cause miscarriages. What she saw and heard grew inside her. Every sight and sound and smell had power. Every sensation was a test. Belly binding, amulets, whispered charms, all served as protection, a way to control fate. Saints were invoked by name. The Virgin Mary was a constant presence, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, Our Lady of Good Success. Suddenly, food became more than nourishment. Some women craved onions or garlic, others chewed bitter roots. Eating well was critical, but certain foods were suspect. Too much cheese could harm the child. Too much heat from spices or pepper brought madness. Fish on Monday ensured a son. On Tuesday would bring a daughter. Dangerous cravings developed. Saliva ran down chins, fingers traced bellies, knuckles whitened as women watched and waited. Fingers counted the weeks, fingers crossed against bad news. Food, so necessary, so fraught. Every meal was monitored by mothers-in-law, neighbors, aunts and sisters. Advice came from every side. When her belly swelled, that was a good sign, but too much fullness was dangerous. Some bellies seemed too round, too large. Some were narrow, pinched, tilted sideways. Some protruded, heavy and low. A midwife would know if something was amiss, hopefully before it was too late. Spices once feared were now prescribed. Each bite was an act of calculation, a balance of taste and texture and temperature and time. In the old days, before doctors took charge, before ultrasounds provided answers, women turned to those who understood the mysteries of the body, the wisdom of generations. They turned to midwives, but midwives were not just practitioners. They were also enforcers of traditions, customs, rules, and restrictions, keepers of secrets and sharers of stories. Midwives were trusted, yes, but also slightly feared. They arrived in the middle of the night, often alone, though sometimes accompanied by helpers. Their cloth bags carried everything they needed: water, salt, dried herbs, maybe even a cat, and always, always silence. The midwife knew when to rub the belly, when to pull, when to let go. She had seen birth and death. She had helped women scream and push and pray and faint. She knew which herbs might ease pain and which ones might end a pregnancy early. She knew how to listen to the heart. She knew where to place the hand. She knew when to turn the woman, to raise the feet, to walk around, to rock, to sing, to speak, to stay silent. She knew when to call for help. She knew which remedies would stop bleeding and which would bring on contractions. She knew the dangers of fever, swelling, insufficient milk. She knew about infection, waiting, about the need for rest, the need for speed, the need for hope. Her knowledge flowed from one generation to the next, from apprentice to master. It was a language spoken only by women. Her presence meant safety, or at least less fear. Midwives remembered every child they delivered, the healthy and the weak, the stillborn, the silent, and they carried every loss. On the walls of her mind were the names of babies never to be spoken. Once the midwife stepped into the birth chamber, she was God. For 9 months she'd been there in spirit. Now she was there in person. When she departed, the room was different, quieter, emptier. The birthing chamber was warm, dim, and tightly enclosed. Windows were shuttered, fires burned hot, curtains surrounded the bed, the world outside disappeared. Only the woman in labor and those close to her remained. Mother, sisters, maybe a grandmother, neighbors, aunts, friends, servants. Men were not allowed, except possibly the priest in case of last rites. The air was thick with heat, whispers and prayers. No clock measured the hours, no music softened the sounds. Birth was long, sometimes hours, sometimes days. There were few positions, but many superstitions. Candles burned low, water was passed quietly, sweat stained every cloth. The midwife doted on details, rituals, signs, symbols. There were moments of joy, but mostly it was agony. After birth, first cries, first feeding, then miraculously sleep, then more cries, more feedings, then finally congratulations. You are a mother. You have survived. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. In the 1800s, 20% of women died giving birth. 20% hemorrhage, fever, exhaustion, a long, slow death or a sudden shock. Some women made wills while still pregnant. Others confessed aloud before their final push. If they survived, they were congratulated. If not, they were remembered in hushed tones. A child might live while the mother did not, or both might die. This was common, and yet each death left a silence. A darkness fell across the room, crushing all sound. The midwife placed a hand on the dead child, another on the mother's belly, closed eyes and whispered, "May God forgive us all." Today, we tell stories of women who gave birth in the olden times, in simpler times, in better times. We imagine them in quaint rooms with gingham curtains and wallpaper and polished wood. We think of them as serene, strong, stoic. We sanitize their pain and ignore their fears. We forget the toll childbirth took and takes on their bodies and their minds. We remember grandmothers and great-grandmothers who gave birth multiple times. How did they do it? Why did they keep going? What did they dream about? What did they long for? What did they weep about? What did they see in the faces of their children? How did their children change them? How did they change the world? We don't ask these questions. Most important, how did it feel to be a woman in labor, to be a midwife in the olden times? How does it feel today? What is the meaning of motherhood? What is the price of motherhood? What is the legacy of motherhood? I am a mother. I gave birth in hospitals, at home, in the rain, in snow. I had epidurals and natural births. I pushed, and I didn't push. I held my babies immediately after birth and waited hours before holding them. My children are the center of my world, but my experience is singular. I speak only for myself, but I want to know your story too. So I'll end by asking, how did you come into the world? What led up to that moment? What happened in the room? Who were you? Where did you grow up? What did you dream about? What did you fear? What did you hope for? Did you have a say in your story? Did anyone else have a say in your story? Did anyone else matter? Does anyone else's story matter? What does your story mean to you? Baptism and naming. If the child was born breathing, baptism followed quickly. Even a weak gasp was enough. Some were baptized before the umbilical cord was cut, just in case. The priest might rush in. Water was poured. Latin was mumbled. If no priest was present, a midwife might perform the rite herself. It was better than risking eternal limbo. Names were drawn from saints, grandparents, or calendar days, sometimes reused from siblings who hadn't lived, feeding, crying, and sleeping. If both mother and child survived, the next challenge began. Feeding from the breast every few hours, crying that couldn't be explained, sleep that never truly came. Beds were shared. Babies swaddled so tightly they could not move. Many infants died in sleep, unnoticed. Mothers were blamed, sometimes punished. Still, lullabies filled the home, simple melodies about angels, saints, or food. Some songs were warnings, others were just comfort, raising the living, burying the lost. Mothers might have 10 children and bury 5. Some lost newborns, others lost toddlers, fever, hunger, teething, or the cold. It didn't take much. Tiny graves marked the edge of the cemetery. Some women grieved in silence. Others named every loss aloud in prayer. Grief was private, but also universal. Women helped one another carry it. They understood each other in looks and gestures. It was part of life, always. The memory of motherhood. For those who survived into old age, their children became their legacy. Some cared for them in old age. Others disappeared into war, marriage, or plague. Mothers told stories of when he was born, of how she walked early, of the fever that nearly took them. These memories kept them whole. To be a mother was to carry life, loss, love, and labor, without praise, without pause. A woman in a medieval castle sits all day in her chamber. She has nothing to do but embroider fancy cloths and gaze out the window, daydreaming about handsome knights. Sound familiar? Maybe you've heard this story or something like it before. Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Welcome to the series. Today, we are going to talk about what women actually did all day in medieval times. We will look at how their lives varied between classes and locations, how they made money and put food on the table. So grab your peasant blouse or velvet gown and join me in the time-traveling TARDIS. It's going to be a great time. And remember, don't believe everything you learned in school. Assumptions about the past can be dangerous things. In our modern world, we love a good work-life balance. We take pride in career or family, or maybe a hobby we enjoy outside of work. But when we imagine medieval life, especially for women, we tend to assume that their days were filled with leisure and idle gossip. The idea of the idle woman is an assumption that pervades much of our understanding of medieval life. The image of the lazy woman first appeared in the 1800s, created by those who wanted to justify limiting women's rights. In other words, people who wanted women to stay home having babies instead of being out in society. It stuck. And today it means that when we imagine medieval life, we picture women spending all day spinning useless tales, gossiping, being catty, and generally doing nothing of value. But the truth is, a medieval woman's day was filled with labor. Work followed her from hearth to field, shop to stable, all day from sunrise to nightfall. Now, let's go back in time and meet some real medieval women. This is our host. A peasant woman's work was hard and endless. Her days began before sunrise and continued past sunset. She woke up before dawn to feed animals and start fires. Then she helped children dress, made beds, swept floors, kneaded dough, churned butter, mended clothes, gathered fuel, and fetched water. These tasks were in addition to farming work, which occupied a large part of every peasant's day. On rural land, women worked beside men. They planted flax, weeded vegetable plots, collected herbs, fed animals, and harvested grain. They milked goats and cows before dawn, carried heavy pails, and processed the results into cheese or butter. They gleaned, gathering leftover crops after the main harvest. This was legal, sacred work, rooted in biblical permission. It was a right for the poor and a lifeline for families. After dinner, when daylight hours allowed, women ground grain, threshed and winnowed grain, cleaned and repaired fishing nets, made soap and candles, preserved fruit, picked berries, gathered firewood, and prepared meals. Food didn't just appear. It was grown, preserved, and managed by women's hands. Dinner might include bread, cheese, milk, porridge, fruit, nuts, and beer. Women grew, processed, and served it all. In the evening, women spun thread while men repaired tools and equipment. If there was free time, it was spent visiting neighbors or relatives, praying, singing, or dancing. Women also attended church regularly, sometimes acting as godmothers, midwives, and wet nurses. Finally, asleep in the evening. Their work wasn't done. Peasants lived with the constant threat of famine, so even in sleep they were watchful. It fell to women to wake up first, start the fire, prepare breakfast, and send men and children out to check fields and storage. No one could predict when the next storm would damage crops or a mouse would eat through stored grain. Women had to act fast when problems arose. Our next time traveler hails from a town, but not all medieval women lived on farms. In urban areas, women worked alongside men, performing many of the same tasks. However, their distribution of labor differed between households. In a middle-class home, a wife might run a shop, help her husband craft goods, or welcome paying guests into their home. Women of wealthier merchant or artisan families often had specialized roles. They might manage a business. For example, the wife of a London merchant in the late Middle Ages might oversee her husband's import business when he went on trips. Women of the highest class could wield significant power. When the plague hit England in the 1340s, Queen Isabella of France stepped in to keep trade routes open so that supplies could continue to reach England. That kind of responsibility was more the exception than the rule, but women were known to manage shops and businesses in their own right. Once again, if they were widowed, daughters assisted mothers in running a business until they married. When not working in a trade, women cooked, cleaned, and cared for children. Those with extra money might hire servants. Town women also had access to markets where they could buy and sell goods. Here, they competed economically with men, earning money for themselves or their families. In these bustling places, women hawked eggs, vegetables, candles, cloth, or fish. They haggled, carried baskets on their hips, and managed coin with swift fingers. Some women controlled small stalls, others worked for their husbands. Widows often took over shops. Daughters assisted. Housewives bartered. Every transaction was survival. Each sale a negotiation. While life in town offered more options, responsibilities still piled upon medieval women. They ran households, raised children, produced food, managed finances, and participated in markets. Finally, we arrive at the castle, where our fair maiden awaits. Well, sort of. Medieval women of noble birth had fewer chores than their peasant sisters, but traded gossip for strategy. In this luxurious setting, women were expected to manage the household. They oversaw servants, made sure guests were well treated, and kept an eye on finances. Since few nobles employed accountants, women managed accounts and records, a job that required strong math skills. In fact, noble women often received advanced training in accounting. Now, did that leave them with free time? Not really. Noble women were also expected to produce heirs and care for children. In other words, lots of babies. The endless pregnancies and child-rearing made noble life difficult. And yes, there were midwives and wet nurses, but someone had to pay them and make sure they did their jobs well. Someone also had to teach children their manners, faith, and how to run a household. And you guessed it, it fell to women. After children were old enough to attend court or be married off for strategic advantage, noble women hosted parties, welcomed visitors, negotiated alliances, and managed property. Sometimes they went on crusade. Like Queens Isabella of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, they led armies and made key decisions. Most of the time, though, they stayed home, keeping the wheels of court turning smoothly. From sunrise to nightfall, medieval women worked. They cooked, cleaned, farmed, managed businesses, and raised children. They were cooks, healers, cleaners, merchants, field hands, and teachers, all at once. Work wasn't always easy. In fact, most of the time it was hard, long, and thankless, but their labor kept households, farms, and cities functioning. Without women, medieval society couldn't have survived. So what did medieval women do all day? Everything. Next time you hear someone say that women belonged in the home, consider all the places medieval women worked. Think about all the things they accomplished. Then say, don't believe everything you learned in school. And with that, thanks for joining me on my time-traveling adventure. I hope you enjoyed learning about medieval women. And remember, you can learn more about the past through additional resources. Domestic service and the life of a maid. Many girls worked as servants in larger households. They scrubbed floors, carried water, stoked fires, and assisted in kitchens. Some slept on straw near the hearth. Others shared cramped quarters with fellow maids. Mistresses could be kind or cruel. Tasks were endless. Gratitude was rare. But service offered food, lodging, and sometimes safety from worse fates. Childcare, nursing, and elder work women didn't only raise their own children, they often raised others. Wet nurses were hired by the wealthy. Older daughters became second mothers to siblings. Caring for the sick and elderly also fell to women. There were no hospitals, only homes. They changed linens, applied herbs, whispered prayers, and bore witness. Religious labor and sacred roles. In convents, women copied manuscripts, tended gardens, managed estates, and distributed alms. They ran schools for girls and infirmaries for the sick. They labored for God and for one another. Outside, parish women prepared church linens, baked for feast days, and helped decorate altars. Faith and work were woven tightly. The invisible economy. Much of women's labor wasn't paid or even noticed. Cooking, cleaning, mending, nursing, tending gardens, managing household stores. These weren't considered work, but duty. Yet they demanded time, strength, and skill. Women kept homes functional, farms productive, and towns alive. They were the quiet force in every corner of life, resilience in repetition. Their work repeated daily. It was cyclical, tied to seasons, bodies, and tradition. Yet in that repetition was meaning. A child fed, a cloth repaired, a fire tended, a body comforted. There was dignity in the ordinary, honor in the overlooked. A woman in a medieval castle sits all day in her chamber. She has nothing to do but embroider fancy cloths, and gaze out the window, daydreaming about handsome knights. Sound familiar? Maybe you've heard this story or something like it before. Hi everyone. Welcome to the series. Today, we are going to talk about what women actually did all day in medieval times. We will look at how their lives varied between classes and locations, how they made money and put food on the table. So grab your peasant blouse or velvet gown and join me in the time-traveling TARDIS. It's going to be a great time. And remember, don't believe everything you learned in school. Assumptions about the past can be dangerous things. In our modern world, we love a good work-life balance. We take pride in career or family, or maybe a hobby we enjoy outside of work. But when we imagine medieval life, especially for women, we tend to assume that their days were filled with leisure and idle gossip. The idea of the idle woman is an assumption that pervades much of our understanding of medieval life. The image of the lazy woman first appeared in the 1800s, created by those who wanted to justify limiting women's rights. In other words, people who wanted women to stay home having babies instead of being out in society. It stuck. And today it means that when we imagine medieval life, we picture women spending all day spinning useless tales, gossiping, being catty, and generally doing nothing of value. But the truth is, a medieval woman's day was filled with labor. Work followed her from hearth to field, shop to stable, all day from sunrise to nightfall. Now, let's go back in time and meet some real medieval women. This is our host. A peasant woman's work was hard and endless. Her days began before sunrise and continued past sunset. She woke up before dawn to feed animals and start fires. Then she helped children dress, made beds, swept floors, kneaded dough, churned butter, mended clothes, gathered fuel and fetched water. These tasks were in addition to farming work, which occupied a large part of every peasant's day. On rural land, women worked beside men. They planted flax, weeded vegetable plots, collected herbs, fed animals and harvested grain. They milked goats and cows before dawn, carried heavy pails, and processed the results into cheese or butter. They gleaned, gathering leftover crops after the main harvest. This was legal, sacred work, rooted in biblical permission. It was a right for the poor and a lifeline for families. After dinner, when daylight hours allowed, women ground grain, threshed and winnowed grain, cleaned and repaired fishing nets, made soap and candles, preserved fruit, picked berries, gathered firewood, and prepared meals. Food didn't just appear. It was grown, preserved, and managed by women's hands. Dinner might include bread, cheese, milk, porridge, fruit, nuts, and beer. Women grew, processed, and served it all. In the evening, women spun thread while men repaired tools and equipment. If there was free time, it was spent visiting neighbors or relatives, praying, singing, or dancing. Women also attended church regularly, sometimes acting as godmothers, midwives, and wet nurses. Finally, asleep in the evening. Their work wasn't done. Peasants lived with the constant threat of famine, so even in sleep, they were watchful. It fell to women to wake up first, start the fire, prepare breakfast, and send men and children out to check fields and storage. No one could predict when the next storm would damage crops or a mouse would eat through stored grain. Women had to act fast when problems arose. Our next time traveler hails from a town, but not all medieval women lived on farms. In urban areas, women worked alongside men, performing many of the same tasks. However, their distribution of labor differed between households. In a middle-class home, a wife might run a shop, help her husband craft goods, or welcome paying guests into their home. Women of wealthier merchant or artisan families often had specialized roles. They might manage a business. For example, the wife of a London merchant in the late Middle Ages might oversee her husband's import business when he went on trips. Women of the highest class could wield significant power. When the plague hit England in the 1340s, Queen Isabella of France stepped in to keep trade routes open so that supplies could continue to reach England. That kind of responsibility was more the exception than the rule, but women were known to manage shops and businesses in their own right. Once again, if they were widowed, daughters assisted mothers in running a business until they married. When not working in a trade, women cooked, cleaned, and cared for children. Those with extra money might hire servants. Town women also had access to markets where they could buy and sell goods. Here, they competed economically with men, earning money for themselves or their families. In these bustling places, women hawked eggs, vegetables, candles, cloth, or fish. They haggled, carried baskets on their hips, and managed coin with swift fingers. Some women controlled small stalls, others worked for their husbands. Widows often took over shops. Daughters assisted. Housewives bartered. Every transaction was survival. Each sale, a negotiation. While life in town offered more options, responsibilities still piled upon medieval women. They ran households, raised children, produced food, managed finances, and participated in markets. Finally, we arrive at the castle, where our fair maiden awaits. Well, sort of. Medieval women of noble birth had fewer chores than their peasant sisters, but traded gossip for strategy. In this luxurious setting, women were expected to manage the household. They oversaw servants, made sure guests were well treated, and kept an eye on finances. Since few nobles employed accountants, women managed accounts and records, a job that required strong math skills. In fact, noble women often received advanced training in accounting. Now, did that leave them with free time? Not really. Noble women were also expected to produce heirs and care for children. In other words, lots of babies. The endless pregnancies and child-rearing made noble life difficult. And yes, there were midwives and wet nurses, but someone had to pay them and make sure they did their jobs well. Someone also had to teach children their manners, faith, and how to run a household. And you guessed it, it fell to women. After children were old enough to attend court or be married off for strategic advantage, noble women hosted parties, welcomed visitors, negotiated alliances, and managed property. Sometimes they went on crusade. Like Queens Isabella of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, they led armies and made key decisions. Most of the time, though, they stayed home, keeping the wheels of court turning smoothly. From sunrise to nightfall, medieval women worked. They cooked, cleaned, farmed, managed businesses, and raised children. They were cooks, healers, cleaners, merchants, field hands, and teachers, all at once. Work wasn't always easy. In fact, most of the time it was hard, long, and thankless, but their labor kept households, farms, and cities functioning. Without women, medieval society couldn't have survived. So what did medieval women do all day? Everything. Next time you hear someone say that women belonged in the home, consider all the places medieval women worked. Think about all the things they accomplished. Then say, don't believe everything you learned in school. And with that, thanks for joining me on my time-traveling adventure. I hope you enjoyed learning about medieval women. And remember, you can learn more about the past through additional resources. Fast days, feast days, and women's rituals. The church calendar ruled time. Lent, Advent, Saints' days. These marked the year. Women adapted recipes for fasts, planned feasts with care, and decorated homes for holy celebrations. Feast days were rare joys, time for laughter, wine, sweet bread, and song. Fast days were hard, especially for the pregnant or ill. Yet women often fasted anyway, believing sacrifice made them holy. The role of confession and forgiveness. Confession was required, but for many women, it was also emotional survival. Behind the screen, they told their truths, desires, losses, doubts. The priest might lecture or comfort, often both. Confession was one of few places where a woman's inner life was acknowledged aloud. And though her voice might tremble, it mattered. Women as moral guardians' wives, mothers and widows were expected to uphold the moral tone of the household. They reminded children to cross themselves, corrected husbands, refused gossip, or gave in to it. They prayed for the dead, instructed the living, and judged themselves harshly. If sin came into the home, they often felt it was their fault and prayed harder. Mysticism, visions, and personal revelations. Some women saw more. In convents and sometimes beyond, women reported visions of Christ, of Mary, of angels or suffering souls. Some heard voices, others wrote them down. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich left behind brilliant writings, but many others remained anonymous, their visions buried with them. Still, for brief moments, these women became prophets in a world that rarely listened. Heresy, fear, and silence. Not all paths were welcomed. Women who questioned doctrine, claimed visions, or taught others could be accused of heresy. The line between holy and dangerous was thin, so many stayed quiet. They prayed silently, worshipped in gestures, believed deeply but carefully. Faith as refuge. For the lonely, the grieving, the powerless, faith was a refuge. Not always joy, but purpose, structure, belonging. In whispered rosaries, smoky chapels, or candlelit corners, medieval women found God, or at least a reason to endure. Imagine waking up before the sun, hearing vendors beginning their calls, horses clattering on the cobblestones, the smell of fresh bread mixed with sewage and smoke. Imagine that this is your world, where privacy does not exist. You wash in a shared yard, you listen through thin walls, you move carefully, always watched. This is life in a city street, and this is our series, Life in Medieval Times. We've already looked at rural life in the Middle Ages, how the vast majority of people in medieval Europe lived on farms, growing food and taking care of animals. But if you've ever visited a big city, you know it's a very different experience. So what was daily life like for a woman in the Middle Ages who lived in a city? Let's find out. Most city women lived in crowded, noisy conditions. They might live above a shop, beside a tannery, or behind a church. And while some were wealthy, most were poor. Their lives revolved around their work and caring for family members, and their days often started before the sun came up. The workday begins. What time do you get up in the morning? If you're like me, probably not too early. But for medieval city women, their workday began before dawn. While some slept late into the morning, most got up with the sun or soon after. In fact, she might have been awake before anyone else in her family. That's because even if she didn't have to start work right away, she still had chores to do. She fed chickens and other animals. She gathered up the day's breakfast and perhaps did some laundry or other household tasks. She might have had a little time to mend clothes or make shoes, but she also needed to prepare her stall for the market. If she sold things like fruit or vegetables, she had to get them ready for sale. And if she was a craftswoman, she needed to gather up her tools and materials. All this before everyone else was awake. Then she joined her husband and children in eating whatever simple breakfast they had. Perhaps a piece of stale bread dipped in wine, or porridge made with milk and grain. And then it was off to work. City women were always busy. Some ran stalls at markets, others helped in taverns, workshops, or dye houses. Most worked long hours, though sometimes with breaks for festivals and saints' days. These jobs were usually low status and low paying. Most women earned about half of what men did. Because jobs were so limited, they took whatever work they could find. And in general, their work shifted depending on their age. Young girls might help their mothers or aunts. As they grew older, they might take on some tasks traditionally reserved for men, such as weaving or brewing. And if they married, they often continued to do these jobs. Apprenticeships were rare for women, but girls still learned trades through mothers, aunts, and neighbors. By the end of the Middle Ages, some cities allowed women into guilds, groups of people who worked in the same trade and set standards for products and prices. This was especially true for crafts like silk making in Paris or brewing in England. Usually only men had this kind of recognition for their work, but these guilds could be powerful. Being a member meant having the right to work in a particular occupation. It meant a higher status, access to better training and equipment, and the ability to raise prices. Widows could sometimes inherit a husband's membership, and daughters could assist their fathers. But ultimately, power remained with men. Women could not always join guilds, but they could sell their wares in a market. Markets were more democratic places. A woman with a good product and a strong voice could hold her ground. She haggled over prices. She joked with customers. She protected her goods from thieves. She counted coins quickly and with eyes always scanning for pickpockets. There were dangers for women working alone, but if she sold her wares on the street or at a market, she could earn a decent wage. But that wasn't the only work a city woman did. She might also work in a tavern owned by her husband or father. She served food and drink. She cleaned up messes, she tended the fire, and she managed the accounts, all while keeping an eye out for thieves and drunks. Other women worked in homes, either their own or those of wealthy families. They cleaned, cooked, and took care of children. For noble families, these servants might have some specialized skills. They might run a household or manage accounts. They might teach children or entertain guests. Often, however, they did the same kinds of work as other women. They scrubbed floors, hauled water, spun yarn, and otherwise kept the household running. When the workday ended, it didn't really end, it just changed form. A woman might spend her evenings doing the same work she did during the day, but now at home. After all, she didn't get paid for her work in the household, and someone had to keep it running. So she cooked meals, cleaned up, mended clothes, took care of animals, and perhaps sat and gossiped with her friends. Evenings were also a time for religious activities. She prayed with her family, perhaps saying the rosary or other devotional exercises. She taught her children prayers and made sure they went to church the next day. Then it was bedtime. And now you might think this sounds hard, and it was. But women weren't alone in this. Men did the same things. He woke up early, said his prayers, worked all day, ate a simple meal, and went to bed tired. The difference was that the man was likely to have his own business or workshop. His work would have been outside the home, and he would have been able to leave the domestic work to his wife and daughters. Women had few choices when it came to work. They couldn't go into many of the same occupations as men, and most of their jobs were low status and low paying. But if they worked in a market, a tavern, or even a prestigious noble household, they gained valuable skills and knowledge about the world. She lived in a guild, remember, where gossip flowed freely. She heard the latest news from travelers and merchants. She met people from all walks of life. She knew what was happening in the city and in the world beyond. Guilds, markets, and marginal inclusion. If a woman was lucky, she could belong to a guild, giving her greater access to economic opportunities and allowing her to earn a good wage and even gain some status. But what if she wanted to make money outside of a guild? Then she'd have to rely on the markets. Markets were full of people. Buyers and sellers crowded together along with beggars, pimps, prostitutes, and children at play. You never knew who you'd meet at the market, but there were benefits to the anonymity. A woman could easily lose herself in the crowd. She could blend into the background noise and avoid unwanted attention, yet she also had to remain alert. To succeed as a merchant, she had to watch out for her goods, her money, and herself. Housing, noise, and crowding. Where did city women live? Usually in crowded, noisy conditions. They might live above a shop, beside a tannery, or behind a church. Fires were constant risks, roofs leaked, doors were thin. Families slept together on straw mattresses or wooden planks. Windows were few and small. Privacy did not exist. She washed in a shared yard. She listened through thin walls. She moved carefully, always watched. Sometimes her family might own their home, but more often they rented a room or shared a house with other families. In any case, their homes were narrow, tall, and shared by many. The streets below never rested. Bells rang for mass, executions, or fires. Neighbors quarreled. Beggars pleaded, people yelled greetings or hawked their wares. The city breathed like a living thing, and women had to match its rhythm. Crime, fear, and vulnerability. Living in a city also meant being part of a community, sharing experiences and helping each other out. It also meant putting up with noisy and dangerous crowds. Pickpockets, drunken soldiers, and angry crowds posed constant threats to women. Walking alone at dusk was risky. She might face harassment, slander, or worse. Rumors spread quickly. Reputations were fragile. A woman's clothing or hairstyle might provoke gossip. Her sharp tongue could get her banned from a market. An unkind word to a stranger could bring a knife in the street. Cities were centers of opportunity, culture, and trade, but also of danger. Poverty, disease, and violence were all part of urban life, and women had to navigate these challenges with few legal protections and reliant on a reputation for virtue. Some carried knives, others avoided certain alleys, many walked with friends or stayed indoors after dark. So whether she worked in a prestigious noble household or sold her wares in the market, medieval city women had a lot of responsibilities. They juggled work, family, and community life while watching their every move. They had to be careful with their money, their goods, and themselves. Their work often went unrecognized and they lacked legal protections. But they also had a vibrant public life and the chance to earn a good wage and participate in the cultural and economic life of their city. If you'd like to learn more about medieval history, check out the series Medieval Life. You can watch it here. Disease and the dirty streets plague, leprosy, influenza, boils, fever. Illness spread fast in cities. Waste poured from windows. Rats scurried underfoot. Clean water was precious. Women tried to protect their families with herbs, vinegar, or prayers. Some closed their doors for days, hoping death would pass by. Others risked caring for the sick, often at their own peril. Public rituals and civic life. Despite hardship, the city offered beauty. Feast days lit the streets with banners. Religious processions filled the air with incense and song. Plays, sermons, and markets created moments of color. Women participated fully, bringing offerings, dressing children, preparing altars. They cheered from balconies, fasted in groups, and joined citywide mourning during funerals or famine. Friendship, community, and gossip. Urban women created webs of support. Neighbors became family. Gossip, though often maligned, served as news, warning, or comfort. They borrowed tools, shared food, watched one another's children. When husbands left or illness struck, it was other women who helped first. Their alliances were vital and sometimes delicate. The shadowed lives of the poor. Not all women had shops or homes. Some lived on thresholds, under eaves, or in common rooms. They begged, bartered, and endured judgment. Others sold themselves for bread, not coin. They were rarely named in records. But they too prayed, worked, loved, and hoped. Their stories are stitched in the background, persistent and quiet. City women at the edge. The medieval city offered a woman more movement, more risk, and more anonymity than the village. For some, that meant opportunity. For others, exhaustion. She could disappear into a crowd or rise by wit and labor. But always, she had to navigate between danger and survival, between independence and scrutiny. This series is brought to you by the generous support of my patrons, and you can help keep this series running by supporting us through the link in the description below. Thanks so much for your support. Noble women lived very different lives from the peasant women whose stories we've been hearing. But what exactly did they do all day? What were their lives like? 10.1. The Lady of the Manor. The Lady of the Manor did not plough fields or sell wares. Her world was stone, tapestry, and rank. She was born into an elite class whose wealth and power were secured by birthright. In some cases, marriage or appointment by a monarch. Her life was shaped by duty, not desire. And while she might have had more freedom of choice than a peasant woman, her options were limited by social convention. The lady of the manor was not free to simply live for herself. 10.2. Managing the estate. Her estate was a small kingdom. She oversaw food stores, staff, repairs and rents. She kept detailed records of income and expenses, made sure that the staff were paid and the harvest gathered in, that the cattle were tended and the fields properly ploughed. When her husband was away at war or dead, she ruled in his place. Though she couldn't own property or pass on an inheritance, she could manage her husband's lands and assume his title if he died. She listened to complaints, issued instructions, resolved disputes over boundaries or late rents, collected debts, even pressed suspected witches to get confessions. She knew the names of every servant on the estate, the state of every field, the contents of every storeroom. And if anyone tried to cheat the Lord, they cheated at their peril. Her signature, usually a cross or a monogram, sealed contracts. Her word in many things was law. 10.3. Clothing and appearances. A noble woman wore wealth, silks, furs, elaborate veils. These garments were not for comfort, but for performance. What she wore identified her family and her value system. Once a month, perhaps more often, she would don her finest clothes and present herself at church in all her finery. There she sat ramrod straight, head covered with a wimple and a veil, displaying her beautiful unblemished face to all in attendance. She knew that young girls were watching her, taking note of her colors and fabrics and jewels, trying to emulate her. She also knew that men were watching her, assessing her for signs of fertility, noting how well or how poorly she carried her ample skirts. Sometimes a married woman wore a special garment called a cote-hardie, a long, close-fitting dress with tight sleeves that emphasized her feminine figure. Her clothing said, "Do not touch." But a lady's clothing wasn't just for church. It was for court and the king's entertainment, for events like tournaments, where lords and ladies paraded before the king, for royal progresses, when the king and queen traveled about the realm, staying at noble houses and holding court there. For any number of occasions when nobles were expected to show themselves and be judged. She wore her finest clothes, layers upon layers of silk, linen and wool, sometimes fur trim, a girdle to define her waist, a veil to cover her hair. But the clothing weighed heavy. She wanted to tear it off and be done with it, throw back her head and laugh. But she couldn't. She was always being watched, by God and by her peers. Her clothing was a burden, a statement, and a weapon all in one. 10.4. Marriage as alliance. Her wedding was rarely her choice. Marriages were arranged by fathers, kings, or bishops. She might be sent to a distant land to marry a man she'd never seen before. She might meet him at the altar on the day of their marriage. She was a piece to be moved on the board, an alliance to be forged, a pawn in a game of power. Her own desires had no part in the match. In fact, until the ceremony, she may not even know who she was to marry. She crossed the threshold of her new house not as a bride, but as a symbol, a living representation of her family's colors and values. She became a bridge between two families, carrying messages back and forth. Sometimes affection grew. A groom might fall in love with his bride. A bride might find a kindred spirit in her new home. Often it didn't. Her role was not romance, but alliance, childbirth and diplomacy. She bore her husband's children, legitimized his line, and produced heirs. If she couldn't bear children, her husband might take a mistress, and she might be forced to produce legitimate heirs for him. She welcomed her husband's mistresses into her house, played hostess to visiting noblemen, and made sure that the children born out of wedlock were properly cared for. She managed other people's careers, setting young men up with jobs and titles, sending them off to represent her husband's interests in distant places. She heard confessions and gave absolution in times of scandal. Sometimes she had to send her husband as bastards away with enough money to set them up for life. All the while, her relationship with her husband was purely business. He provided her with a title, protection, and, if he chose, affection. She gave him children, maintained his reputation, and welcomed his mistresses. So long as both parties fulfilled their roles, the marriage worked. 10.5 Diplomacy, letters and quiet power. Many noble women wielded soft but real power. They wrote letters, carefully worded pleas and commands. They maintained alliances, managed household finances, and advised their husbands. Some ran courts in their own right, occasionally acting as regent when their husbands went on crusade or to war. In England, Queen Elizabeth the Fine was famous for her elegant and feminine attire, but she also ruled her kingdom like a Roman emperor. Other noblewomen patronized artists, commissioning works that flattered their appearance or celebrated their family's deeds. In France, Isabella of Aragon raised an army and took the field when her husband was captured by the English. In Germany, Elizabeth of York held court and made decisions about land and marriage that affected the balance of power across Europe. They used every tool at their disposal to get what they wanted: wiles and smiles, flattery and veiled threats. But above all else, they wielded the power of the written word. Most noble women could read and write, though not every nobleman could. And they used their skills to further their own ends. They dictated letters to clerks, instructing them to pay bills, hire servants, oversee repairs, or press a rebellious tenant to pay his rent. Or they wrote in their own hand, carefully, elegantly, deliberately. Some noble women wrote poetry, spinning tales of courtly love and their own frustrated desires. Others wrote practical texts about managing estates, books that helped them run their households and maintain their incomes. Even those who couldn't write could wield the power of the letter. They stamped their seals on documents, sending officials and servants scurrying to make sure that their instructions were carried out. Their words carried weight in the quiet halls of their great houses. We're halfway through our series on medieval daily life. How did you think it went? Which episodes were your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our store for medieval-inspired goodies, including our own beeswax candles. Our series is proudly supported by our patrons. To learn how you can help us keep this series going and gain exclusive access to our medieval history book club, visit our support page. Thanks so much for watching. Religious duties and patronage. She funded altars, donated vestments, and built chapels. She arranged for masses for the dead. She might retreat to prayer during Lent, fast devoutly, or sponsor a convent. Religion was both obligation and comfort. It offered her structure, identity, and, one day, salvation. 10.7 Teaching daughters and guiding sons. She prepared her daughters for marriage, teaching sewing, reading, manners, and patience. She taught her sons to pray, to ride, to rule. She worried for them all. Her letters to children were filled with advice, sorrow, and scripture. Even in absence, she tried to guide them. 10.8 Isolation and confinement. Despite rank, noble women were often isolated. They could not freely walk streets or fields. Visitors were formal, friendships limited, conversation constrained. Their stone walls were cold, their gardens small. Many poured their energy into needlework, writing, or prayer to escape boredom or longing. 10.9 Joys, feasts, and occasions. There were moments of beauty, banquets, music, games, and candlelit evenings. Storytellers came, musicians played, and the hall filled with color and sound. For a night, she could laugh without watching her every gesture. Weddings, births, feast days, these were events she planned with care. They gave rhythm to the long quiet of castle life. 10. Aging in the great house. As she aged, she often gained authority. Widowed noblewomen held lands, advised courts, and sometimes entered convents as patrons or abbesses. If she remained in the manor, she guided younger women, told stories of lineage, and remembered every name on the tapestries. She became the matriarch, both feared and loved. In the seclusion of medieval convents, a world of women unfolded. Sheltered within high walls, these religious communities thrived. And at the heart of it all were the cloister girls. They entered as children, teens, or widows, some willingly and others not so much. Yet their shared journey was marked by one commonality, a life dedicated to God. Welcome to our series, Women of the Medieval World. Today we're diving into the lives of these enigmatic figures, the cloister girls, exploring their everyday realities and dispelling myths that have overshadowed their stories. The year is 1280. In the bustling town of Oxford, England, there's a commotion outside the North Gate. A procession led by two monks is about to enter the Benedictine convent of St. Mary. The group includes a mother with her two daughters, Agnes and Matilda. Agnes is a lively 16-year-old, while Matilda is just 7 years old. Drawn by the promise of spiritual fulfillment, the family has decided to devote Agnes to God, a vow made years ago by their late husband and father. As they approach the gate, the imposing structure symbolizes the significant decision they are about to make. With a mix of hope and sadness, they step through the archway, leaving behind the familiar streets of Oxford and entering the cloistered grounds, where the lives of these two young girls will change dramatically. Convents in the Middle Ages weren't just houses of worship. They were self-sufficient communities with nuns taking on roles similar to those in secular society. There were sacristans responsible for church decorum, infirmaries to tend to the sick, and even gardeners to maintain the convent's greenery. This responsibility extended to their livestock too. Nuns cared for animals, providing milk, eggs, wool, and meat for consumption. Acquiring resources off-site was usually delegated to lay brothers who lived separately but supported the nuns' cloistered existence. Although rare, there were instances of nuns venturing out, often to visit the sick or preach, as exemplified by the remarkable Gertrude the Great. But let's delve deeper into what it truly meant to be a cloister girl. These girls weren't necessarily young. Some were teenagers like Agnes, while others could be older, even entering as widows seeking solace. The choice to join a convent was a big one, influenced by various factors. Some were drawn by genuine faith or a desire for peace, while others came under pressure due to social or economic circumstances. Younger daughters without dowries might face pressure to join a convent, ensuring their future. Additionally, parents might offer their daughters to God to fulfill family vows or as a way to secure a son's place in heaven. The entrance ceremony itself was a quiet, solemn affair. A white dress, a veil, a prayer. Sometimes the girl wept, sometimes she smiled. But always she crossed a threshold few ever left. Their days were marked by the rhythm of bells, matins before sunrise, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Each hour punctuated by prayer, psalms, and chant. In between these religious duties, the sisters engaged in various tasks, working in silence. Talking was generally allowed only at certain times, and even then, it was often in hushed tones. This practice wasn't about stifling communication, but about fostering a deeper connection with themselves and their surroundings. By minimizing distractions and external stimuli, the cloister girls cultivated an inner peace and heightened their capacity for introspection. They learned to find solace in solitude, turning inward to explore their thoughts, feelings, and spirituality. In this quiet space, they developed a profound sense of self-awareness, allowing them to understand themselves better and nurture their spiritual growth. The cloister girls' commitment to prayer and reflection was unwavering. They approached their religious duties with reverence and sincerity, finding meaning and purpose in every psalm and chant. This dedication was not merely a ritualistic obligation, but a genuine expression of their faith. The routine provided stability and structure to their lives, offering a sense of continuity and familiarity. It also created a strong sense of community among the sisters as they came together at these designated hours to fulfill their shared religious obligations. In this environment of quiet contemplation, the cloister girls discovered a different way of living, one marked by simplicity, humility, and a deep connection to their faith. It was a lifestyle that demanded resilience, determination, and an unwavering spirit. Through it all, they found solace in the beauty of their surroundings and the richness of their spiritual practices, creating a life of purpose and devotion within the tranquil walls of the convent. In the secluded sanctuary of the convent, the cloister girls immersed themselves in the sacred texts, delving deep into the teachings of the church. Education was highly valued, with many convents serving as centers of learning. Nuns were encouraged to pursue knowledge in various fields, such as scripture, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. They read widely, discussing and debating theological concepts, copied texts, preserving ancient knowledge, and illuminated manuscripts with intricate designs, showcasing their artistic talents. Some cloister girls excelled in music, singing in choirs, and composing hymns that echoed the spirit of their faith. While their lives were structured around religious duties, there was room for intellectual exploration and creative expression within the convent walls. Nuns like Hildegard von Bingen, known for her theological and musical contributions, serve as shining examples of the intellectual pursuits that flourished in such environments. The combination of religious devotion and a thirst for knowledge created a unique atmosphere where the cloister girls didn't just learn about the divine, but also contemplated the mysteries of the universe and humanity's place within it. This brings us to an often misunderstood aspect of medieval convents: work. Contrary to popular misconceptions, life here was far from idle. The cloister girls and nuns engaged in various activities throughout the day. They gardened, cooked, sewed, and even illuminated texts, producing beautiful works of art. The work ethic was strong, driven by a combination of religious devotion and the need to sustain the convent. Herbs grown in the gardens might be used for medicinal purposes, while baked bread was often shared with the poor. Copying scripture was not just a task, but an act of devotion. Every stitch, every page illuminated was a prayer, an offering of service. This blend of spiritual duty and practical necessity fostered a sense of community and purpose. The cloister girls learned valuable skills, contributing to the well-being of the convent and its inhabitants. Moreover, this hands-on approach to life helped them develop a deep appreciation for the value of labor and the satisfaction that came from contributing to their community. In the rhythm of daily life within the convent walls, the cloister girls found a balance between spiritual growth and practical engagement with the world around them. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the cloister grounds, the sisters gathered once more for Vespers, the final major prayer of the day. In the fading light, they recited ancient texts, their voices echoing through the stone halls, giving voice to centuries of devotion. The routine provided a sense of comfort and familiarity, a steady rhythm that marked the passage of time in this secluded world. Yet as the shadows deepened, another facet of life in the cloister emerged. It was a time for quiet reflection, for the whispers of memory and the murmurs of anticipation. For the cloister girls, the evening hours held a special significance. After the final prayers, they would often engage in activities that combined work and creativity. With nimble fingers, they mended fabrics, each stitch a silent prayer. They created beautiful garments and household items, transforming simple materials into objects of beauty and utility. This wasn't just about practicality. It was about finding artistry in everyday tasks, infusing their creations with the spirit of their faith. As the night drew in, the cloister girls found solace in these activities, their hands moving rhythmically, their minds at peace. The soft glow of lamplight illuminated not just their workspace, but also the depths of their creativity and resilience. And when the time came for rest, they retired to their dormitories, their days filled with purpose, their spirits nurtured by faith and the quiet beauty of their handiwork. In the medieval world, music wasn't just entertainment. It was a powerful tool for expressing faith and devotion. In the cloisters, it found a special place, weaving itself into the daily lives of the nuns. For the cloister girls, learning music was an integral part of their lives. The sound of singing filled the stone halls, creating an atmosphere of serenity and devotion. Nuns often memorized entire psalters, a testament to their dedication and the importance placed on music in their daily routine. Singing wasn't just a means of entertainment, but a direct connection to the divine. As they raised their voices in unison, the cloister girls felt a sense of unity, their individual voices blending into a harmonious whole. This musical tradition continued with nuns writing music, poetry, and theological visions, adding their voices to the rich tapestry of medieval literature. The cloisters became a place where faith and artistry intertwined, where the melodies sung by the cloister girls echoed not just within the convent walls, but across the ages. This is just one story in the series, Women of the Medieval World. Make sure to check out the other videos to learn about fascinating women like Christine de Pizan, the first Renaissance feminist, and Blanche of Castile, the influential Queen Mother of France. Click on the video that appears on your screen now to continue your journey through time and discover more about these remarkable women who shaped history. Sisterhood and solitude life in the convent was both communal and deeply private. Sisters comforted each other in illness, shared laughter at mealtimes, and mourned together in the chapel. But each also walked her own interior road, quiet, reflective, sometimes lonely. Bonds were strong, but so were silences. A glance could carry more than a sermon, a shared task more than a letter. Visions and mystical experiences. Some nuns experienced visions of Christ, of the Virgin, of divine light. These moments could bring spiritual authority or suspicion. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen or Clare of Assisi were revered. Others were kept quiet, their words too strange, too holy, or too female for the wider world. But even nameless sisters recorded dreams, heard voices in candlelight, or felt divine presence during prayer. Illness, aging, and the end of life. Convents cared for their own. A sister who fell ill was nursed by others, given herbs, whispered prayers, and a clean bed. Aging nuns slowed their pace, rested in warm cloaks, and prayed more deeply. When death came, she was laid in the same habit she had worn daily, buried among her sisters. A candle burned, a name was chanted, then silence. The outside world and the grill. Most convents were enclosed. Women could not leave. Visitors spoke through a grill. Letters were rare. News arrived slowly. The world outside felt distant, tempting, chaotic, forgotten. But in the stone cells, candlelit chapels and shadowed gardens, medieval women lived lives of learning, labor, longing and devotion. The world forgot them. God, they believed, never did. Law is supposed to be blind, but throughout history it has been decidedly not. Whose laws we follow, who enforces them, and how they are written and interpreted makes a big difference in who gets protected and who does not. Today, we're looking at a time and place where the scales of justice were very clearly tipped, medieval Europe. How did the law work for women? Let's get into it. Number 1, law by men, for men. Medieval Europe wasn't a single legal system. It was a patchwork of canon law, which came from the Catholic Church, feudal law, which applied to the nobility, and customary law, which varied by region and applied to everyone else. But despite these differences, the core principles were pretty much the same. Women were subjects of the law, but rarely its authors. Women couldn't initiate lawsuits or testify in most cases. They were rarely judges, barristers, or solicitors, and almost never held political office, which made lawmaking unlikely. What little legislation there was tended to be written by men, which isn't surprising when you consider that literacy rates were low and most educated people were men. So we're talking about a system created by an educated elite that mostly benefited other educated elites, but also tried to keep everyone else in their place. The good news is that the system had plenty of holes. People weren't always willing to accept the rulings of courts, especially when those rulings meant that someone was getting away with something. Sometimes resistance took the form of extra-legal action. Commoners sometimes resorted to using violence to achieve their ends, while nobles might band together to try to force a judge's hand. These tactics weren't ideal, of course, since they relied on everyone agreeing that violence was okay in this case. So sometimes people would go through the courts, but they would use every tool available to them to get a favorable ruling. And while this certainly didn't mean that the system worked for women, it does show that it didn't always work the way it was supposed to either. Number 12, coverture, the disappearance in marriage. While medieval law offered limited opportunities for women to participate in the justice system, it did offer them one new legal status upon marriage, that of wife. But that was about the only benefit. Marriage transformed a woman's legal existence. She went from being a person with certain rights and limitations to being covered by her husband. Cover, the word coverture, literally means to cover. It was derived from a law that required married women to wear a head covering, but it had broader implications too. In the eyes of the law, she and her husband became one person, and that person was him. In practice, this meant that a married woman could no longer independently own property, enter into contracts, or sue or be sued. In some cases, she could manage property or even represent herself in court. But that required her husband's consent, and he could easily withhold it. In theory, a wife could take her husband to court if he failed to fulfill his obligations, but that was more of a formality because the whole premise of coverture was that the husband was responsible for providing for her, and if he refused, well, then she had no independent legal standing anyway. Cover, the word, was a product of Roman law, and it stuck around for centuries. Most of Western Europe didn't abandon it until the 19th century, though England held out until 1882. The rationale behind it was that women were too emotional and too easily led to handle money or business dealings on their own. By covering them under her father's or husband's authority, society protected her from exploitation. But really it just meant that no one exploited her. 12.3 Inheritance, daughters and disappointment. In medieval inheritance law, sons inherited land, daughters inherited dowries. That was the general rule anyway. Dowries were sums of money or property that a father gave to his daughter to help set her up for marriage. If a daughter stayed unmarried, the property would eventually revert back to the family. Meanwhile, sons were expected to take over their father's land and continue the family's bloodline. So when a father died, his son inherited everything from him, including his position in society, his debts, and even his wife, subject to the niceties of coverture, of course. This was the situation in most places, but there were regional variations. In some areas like northern France and parts of Germany, daughters could inherit if there were no sons, while in others, like England, they were completely shut out. This wasn't purely a peasant problem either. Land was the primary concern of the nobility too, and they had similar rules in place to protect their estates. So even if she was rich, a noblewoman couldn't pass on her wealth to her favorite daughter. In fact, she couldn't do much of anything. A woman's place was in her father's household until she married, and then she'd move under her husband's roof. Any land she owned was his. Even if she managed it, all the profits belonged to him. Some wealthy noblewomen fought in court to secure their inheritance, but most were quietly denied. A few got around this by marrying off their daughters to strategic partners. Others used their influence as queen or duchess to shape legislation. But for most, their only option was to marry. Number 12.4, wills, property and widowhood. Speaking of marriage, that was also when women were most likely to find themselves, legally speaking. The ability to write wills was a privilege generally reserved for the elite, but it was one that both men and women could access if they were of noble birth. When a woman wrote a will, she could name beneficiaries, forgive debts, leave money for masses to be said for her soul, and more. Wills were one of the few places where women's voices appeared directly in legal texts. They weren't allowed to own property, but they could at least dispose of any that they had acquired. Widows occupied an interesting legal space. Remember that married women couldn't own property in their own right, but when they lost their husbands, they were suddenly free of coverture and able to manage their late spouse's estate until it could be transferred to the heirs. This included land, houses, shops, farms, and even people. In theory, a widow could hold on to her deceased husband's property for as long as she liked, but in reality, she was usually expected to remarry. If she did, she'd have to account for how she'd spent any money left by her first spouse. But if she didn't, she could hang on to his assets indefinitely. While widows could be shrewd negotiators, buying and selling leases, running shops or collecting rents, they had to be careful. If they were accused of hoarding money or squandering it, they'd have to prove their innocence in court. Number 12.5. Crimes and the gendered courtroom. Women could be accused of crimes just like men, but they were more likely to be charged with crimes considered moral failings. Theft by a woman was often labeled as embezzlement, for instance, rather than theft, and a man was far more likely to be accused of murdering his wife than vice versa. While women could be prosecuted for murder, they had to prove that they acted in self-defense, which was difficult if their husbands were dead, so accusations against them tended to be less serious, though they were still serious enough. Women could be publicly shamed, fined, flogged, or branded. If convicted, they could also be sentenced to death. When a woman appeared in court, she often needed a male representative to speak on her behalf. This was true for all social classes, though higher status women were more likely to have the option of speaking for themselves. In most cases, the court preferred to hear evidence from men. A woman's testimony wasn't necessarily inadmissible, but it was often discounted in favor of a man's version of events. But that wasn't always the case. Women were especially likely to speak up in cases involving honor, land, or defamation, which meant that occasionally a woman's voice could be heard in court. Whether that made the system work for women, of course, is debatable. All in all, medieval European law worked for women about as well as it worked for anyone else who didn't happen to be a man. Its systems were biased against them, its privileges passed them by. But that didn't mean that women had no recourse. They could fight for their inheritance, they could speak in defense of their honor, and they could even stand trial for crimes, though hopefully they didn't need to. For a look at another time and place with its own brand of gendered injustice, check out our series on the history of rape. Or for something a little different, check out our series on the history of racism. The law of the household. Most justice never reached court. It was administered at home through family, custom, or village councils. Women were judged by mothers-in-law, husbands, neighbors, and priests. They were punished for speaking out, for dressing improperly, for scolding or wandering. Their behavior was regulated not by law books, but by expectation. They lived under rules not written, but always enforced. Sanctuary and church protection churches offered some refuge. Women fleeing abuse, forced marriage or crime might claim sanctuary inside holy walls. For a time, they were safe. The church could also intervene in marriage disputes. Annulments, while rare, were sometimes granted. Priests recorded baptisms, births, and confessions. In these ledgers, women were briefly visible, but the church too had its power and its silences. Custom, not justice. What mattered most was not what law said, but what custom allowed. And custom varied by region, class, and context. A woman's fate might be decided by a father's generosity, a priest's favor, or a neighbor's grudge. Mercy and cruelty came without appeal. Custom was comfort when kind, tyranny when not, resistance and cleverness. Women found ways around the rules. They disguised property as gifts. They arranged marriages strategically. They wrote letters, invoked saints, or sought powerful patrons. Some used the law against itself. Others ignored it altogether. In the margins of the system, they carved out space, quietly, carefully. Justice imagined, justice denied. True justice for women was rare, but still they hoped. They prayed to saints of fairness, whispered to scribes, pleaded in confession, or told their truth in court, no matter who listened. Their words remain in faded ink, cracked parchment, and the silence between legal lines. Welcome to Life Noggin. Today we are exploring the human body. But fair warning, this is not the Life Noggin you're probably used to. We've traded our usual microscopes and medical marvels for something much more personal, messy, painful, and transformative. During the Middle Ages, people lived in bodies that were, to put it mildly, little understood. And that's an understatement. People back then didn't have our modern understanding of anatomy and physiology. They didn't know about germs or vaccines or how all the parts fit together. And that lack of knowledge wasn't just frustrating, it was often dangerous. Take women's bodies, for example. Back then, medicine was a pretty male-dominated field. Most doctors were men who relied on theories about how the body works that were often more superstition than science. And women's bodies were seen as kind of mysterious, even scary. Male physicians believed that women's bodies were basically just messed up versions of men's bodies, like an inverted or deficient organism. Because of this, many didn't really understand how women's bodies worked or why they did the things they did. Like, you know, that monthly thing. Even though women had been living with these bodies for thousands of years, men's theories dominated the medical world. That means what women actually experienced in their own bodies was rarely what was written down in books or taught in medical schools. Women knew their bodies through sensation and experience and inherited knowledge passed down from other women. But what they felt wasn't always accepted or even acknowledged by society. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into what it would have been like to live in a woman's body during the Middle Ages. Because let's face it, textbooks don't teach you everything. A medieval woman's body moved in cycles. She might have bled, healed, carried, born, all within the span of a few years. Each phase of her life came with risks and rituals, anxieties and expectations. And while there were commonalities across Europe, each culture had its own rules and beliefs. Some women experienced one monthly cycle, others several. Some were an inconvenience, others debilitating. Some were cause for celebration, others for dread. Still, there was one thing that remained constant. Menstruation was shrouded in silence. It was unclean, embarrassing, even shameful. Its arrival announced with pain, cramp, ache, and its departure, sometimes with relief, sometimes with worry. Although menstruation was universal, hardly a day went by without a woman being told to ignore it, overcome it, endure it. Monthly visitor, bloody flux, the curse, all terms for the same thing. For centuries, women were chastised for thinking about the thing that shall not be named. yet simultaneously blamed when they showed any sign of having it. But the menstrual cycle also meant she was healthy and able to bear children. So although it was cursed, it was also essential. Pregnancy was a huge change in a woman's life. Her status shifted. She gained new rights and protections, but also new restrictions. In fact, pregnant women couldn't testify in court or sign contracts. If a pregnant woman died, her husband could remarry. Blame for the loss, however, usually fell on the widow anyway. Childbirth itself was risky business. Infections, hemorrhaging, difficult deliveries were always a threat. No wonder only a third of European women reached the age of 40. Women lived with constant, inescapable pain. They dealt with headaches, cramps, toothaches, arthritis. They suffered injuries, infections too. Imagine living in a body where something as simple as a cough could kill you. So women turned to remedies, herbal teas, warm baths, supportive friends, but mostly they endured. And not just because they had to, but also because pain was seen as a virtue. Fasting or flagellation, that self-inflicted pain, was sometimes used to cleanse or punish the body. In some cases, pain was a test from God. In others, it was punishment for a sin. Sometimes it was even welcomed. Certain saints were known for embracing pain, seeking it out, welcoming it as a way to deepen their connection with the divine. And sure, we have a long way to go before we fully understand the human body, but we've come a long way from the days of bleeding and purging. And if you want to learn more about those wacky theories about how the body works, check out this video right here. One way women tried to ease the aches and pains of their monthly visitor or other ailments was with home remedies. Things like chamomile tea, which is still popular today, was used to treat stomach pains and insomnia, while crushed lavender or marigolds might be applied topically to help with skin irritants. Poultices, which are kind of like medicinal bandages, were made from ingredients like comfrey to help heal wounds or bruises, but the exact recipes and treatments would vary based on the time period, location, and the person making them. There were lots of different options for treating the same ailment, and not everyone would work for everyone every time. Treatments weren't always pleasant either. For example, some people believed that a darning needle stuck behind the ear could cure an earache. What do you think? Would you try these remedies? Let us know in the comments below. Often the first line of treatment for illness, injury, or even pregnancy was home remedies. These were affordable, accessible, and usually pretty safe. However, when things got really bad, women would turn to midwives and healers. Midwives were especially important. They weren't just baby delivery specialists, they were general healers, offering treatments for everything from wounds to illnesses to burns to miscarriages. Midwives also helped deliver babies, both vaginally and via C-section. But even when women sought professional help, they weren't necessarily getting modern medicine. They were getting folk medicine. It was practical, based on years of experience and community knowledge. Doctors might have been revered or feared, but midwives were respected by both men and women. After all, they were dealing with one of the most intimate parts of women's lives, birth. But they walked a fine line between healing and witchcraft. In fact, a midwife was twice as likely to be accused of being a witch as a healer, largely because of the intimate knowledge they had of women's bodies. While midwives delivered babies, other women were employed to help with more extreme cases of female ailments. These women were likely older, more experienced, and often considered wise. These wise women would have a broad range of tools and treatments at their disposal, from salves to setting broken bones. These healers were both revered and feared. Turning to them meant trusting someone outside your family to enter your most private moments. Not only did these women need to be knowledgeable, but also trustworthy. When priests weren't called upon to save a life, these women were. And if a priest was around, he might be the one to offer last rites or absolution for sins, but the actual healing would be done by a woman. In addition to assisting with childbirth, midwives and healers also treated illnesses and injuries. They diagnosed fevers, set broken bones, and treated everything from snake bites to eye problems. They were also the ones who applied salves and poultices to stop bleeding or soothe burns. These women were experts in their field, but they weren't always taken seriously by the men who dominated the medical profession. We know all about penicillin and MRSA and antibiotics, but back then, treating an infection could mean the difference between life and death. Sometimes treatments were helpful, sometimes they were harmful, and sometimes they didn't do anything at all. Common ways to treat infection included honey or vinegar, and for serious cases, bloodletting. Bloodletting was the practice of removing blood from the body through methods like leeching. The idea was that by removing the bad or corrupted blood, you would get rid of the infection. Treatments like these were often used by midwives and healers, but were sometimes performed by doctors as well. Ultimately, if whatever was ailing you was treatable, you'd likely be treated by a woman. Whether it was a midwife, healer, herbalist, or some other title, the majority of healthcare was administered by women, and it wasn't unusual for these women to be the ones coming up with the treatments in the first place. However, if you were really sick, like with the bubonic plague, you might find yourself in the hands of a doctor. These treatments could include blistering, purging, bloodletting, scarification. Basically, the goal was to expel the disease from the body, and this usually involved pain. There was no anesthesia, so pain was inevitable. Women also couldn't really ask for pain relief. Their suffering was seen as their fault, their burden to bear. There was also no real understanding of how the body worked, so treatments were more guesswork than science. This meant that many women died unnecessarily. It might seem crazy now, but during the Middle Ages, women were routinely subjected to brutal surgeries without painkillers. This wasn't just for big operations either. Even something as simple as removing a small growth could be incredibly painful. And because there were no antiseptics, these procedures were risky, often leading to infection and further complications. So what was it like to have surgery without any pain relief? Well, imagine lying on a cold stone table, knowing that soon you'll be cut open without any painkillers. That's exactly what women had to endure. And it wasn't uncommon for them to faint from the pain. Once the operation was over, they'd be stitched up and left to recover on their own. If they survived, that is. So if you're grateful for modern medicine and pain relief, just remember that women had to fight for every step we've made. So what do you think? How would you feel about living in a body like this? Do you have any family members or friends who have gone through similar experiences? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Pregnancy and the fragile body. The female body was most vulnerable during pregnancy and birth. Pelvic pain, swelling, nausea, none of it was seen as a condition to treat, only to survive. Childbirth was often brutal. Many did not recover. Those who did bore scars for life, physical and silent. Women whispered their own remedies, carried talismans, prayed constantly, and when all else failed, they endured. Aging and the vanishing woman. A woman past childbearing was often seen as no longer useful. Her body, now wrinkled and tired, faded from view. She might become the household's grandmother, the wise widow, or the local herbalist. Some gained power, others lived in loneliness, but all aged without comfort. There were no doctors for aching joints, no relief for failing eyes, just time, woolen wraps, and memory. Beauty, hygiene, and embodiment beauty was not only aesthetic, it was moral. A clean face meant a clean soul. Oily hair, stained teeth, or strange smells brought shame. Women bathed when they could. In rivers, tubs, or warmed basins, they scrubbed with ash, herbs, and cloth. They perfumed their bodies with rosewater, wore braided hair, or used powders to lighten the skin. But hygiene was a luxury. Dirt clung to poverty, shame, secrecy, and the female flesh. The female body was watched, policed, judged. Girls were told to hide, cover, silence, to move modestly, to bathe alone, to never speak of pain, bleeding, or desire. And so, many women carried their bodies like secrets. They bent their backs, closed their mouths, held their breath, but still they danced when alone, laughed until breathless, touched life with bare hands, the body as burden and as home. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to live inside contradiction, sacred yet sinful, fragile yet necessary, hidden yet exposed. Her body bore work, children, wounds and wonder. It bled and healed, it fed and comforted, it broke and endured. No parchment praised it, but it remembered everything. Welcome to my channel. Today we're looking at 6 ways women were punished in the past. Before we get started, I need to let you know this video contains mature themes and may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 1. The scold and the gossip. Women were punished for speaking out of turn, speaking too much, speaking too sharply, or speaking too publicly. In other words, saying things that should have been left unsaid. There was no law against being a gossip or a scold, but there were laws against slander and defamation. If a woman used her tongue to harm another person's reputation, she could be charged with slander or libel. If she did it in church, she might be charged with a more serious crime. In England, the scolding law made it a crime for a woman to hold a contentious public debate with a man. A scold was a contentious woman, one who contradicted men and challenged their authority, one who talked back to a man or argued with him, one who held forth on religious or political topics. A scold was a woman who went against the social order. Her punishment would depend on her crime. She might be ducked in a pond. This was an English punishment that involved binding the woman's hands behind her back, wrapping her in a weighted bag, and then dropping her into a pond. The idea was to drown out her contentiousness. Another option was being paraded with a bridle of iron in her mouth. She would be forced to walk through the streets with a metal muzzle on her face. Sometimes the bridle would have a bell attached to it so everyone could hear her as she walked. An even more severe form of punishment involved being mocked in public. She would be forced to stand in the market square while people threw things at her, spat at her, yelled insults, or made lewd gestures. For the most extreme cases, the punishment might involve being silenced, shamed, sewn up in a leather bag along with a goose, and then paraded around town. Being a scold was dangerous, not because of any physical harm, but because of the social stigma attached to it. In a time when obedience was praised, a sharp tongue could mean becoming an outcast. Number 2, the witch next door. Women were punished for living alone, gathering herbs, healing the sick, for having no husband. Accusations of witchcraft were common in early modern Europe and North America. So were the fears that accompanied them. Fear of the devil, fear of the unknown, fear of those who seemed different. In a culture that valued obedience and conformity, women who practiced folk medicine or lived outside the expectations of society were prime targets. They were easy to accuse, easier to convict, and hardest to defend. The typical witch was an older woman who lived alone and kept to herself. She was an outsider, someone different. She was someone who didn't fit in. She was someone who didn't belong. She was an easy target. She was also an obvious suspect. If a cow died, a child fell ill, a crop failed, the village needed someone to blame. Midwives were blamed for children dying at birth or soon after. Widows were blamed for bringing bad luck. Herbalists were blamed for using the devil's herbs and brew. For a woman who didn't conform, it was always a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet for every witch accused, there were dozens more who slipped through the net, who managed to hide their difference, who managed to avoid suspicion. But witchcraft accusations often came from fear, envy, or grief. A good harvest meant everyone was hungry for gossip. An illness in the community meant everyone was searching for answers. and a death in the family meant everyone was looking for someone to blame. Number 3, trials without justice. Women were punished for not confessing, for remaining silent, for insisting on their innocence. Trials for witchcraft were rarely fair. Evidence included birthmarks, miscarriages, or dreams. A neighbor's rumor could bring arrest. A priest's suspicion could mean torture, and inquisitors demanded confession. In Europe, during the 14th to 18th centuries, confessions were extracted through sleep deprivation, drowning, beatings, starvation, stress positions, anything to make a woman admit what they already believed. Many confessed just to die quickly. Some accused others to protect themselves. Most trials ended with the accused woman agreeing to a settlement, which often involved confessing to witchcraft. Those who wouldn't agree to a settlement were executed, usually by burning or hanging. In some cases, the accused were drowned. In Scotland, the accused were burned alive. In England, they were hanged. In America, they were hanged, shot, or killed by burning. In France, they were thrown into the sea. In Germany, they were burned alive or hanged. In Italy, they were burned alive or buried alive. In Spain, they were burned alive or buried alive. In Switzerland, they were drowned, burned alive, or buried alive. In the Ottoman Empire, they were hanged. In Japan, they were crucified, beheaded, or burned alive. No matter how they were punished, the result was the same. Few survived unscathed, and those that did never quite returned to whole. Number 4, women against women. Women were punished for being jealous, for being envious, for being gossipy. Some women were punished by other women. Some accused others for the sake of saving themselves. Some accused others because they had nothing to lose. Some accused others out of petty revenge. Some accused others out of grief, out of envy, out of fear. Not all danger came from men. In tightly woven communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, jealousy, grief, and rivalry created quiet wars. Neighbors spied on neighbors, friends betrayed friends, sisters denounced sisters, cousins accused cousins, mothers betrayed daughters, daughters accused mothers, wives accused wives. Jealousy corroded trust, grief corrupted compassion, envy twisted love. Suspicion became a way of life, friendships frayed, families broke, communities fractured. Whispers became accusations, rumors grew into scandals, rivalries escalated into betrayals, hatred poisoned everything. In a world without privacy, a woman had to be careful what she said and what she did. You never knew who was listening. You never knew who was watching. You never knew who would be next. No. 5, the female body. Women were punished for having a female body. Women were punished for being naked, for being bruised, for being scratched, for being bitten, for being touched, for having sex, for having babies, for having desires. Women's bodies were often subjected to public punishment. Having sex before marriage might mean being stripped naked and paraded through the streets. Breaking the law meant being branded, shaved, beaten, tied up, whipped, locked up. Barefoot walking through the city meant disgrace, humiliation, pain. Being accused of witchcraft meant being tied to a chair, suspended upside down, submerged underwater, drenched in ice water, doused with hot water, drenched in salt water, sewn up in a sack along with rocks, tar and feathers, torn with red-hot pliers, crushed with red-hot branding irons, naked, exposed, violated. Their bodies became the site of punishment, a performance meant to shame, to warn, to silence. Thank you for watching. Do you know of any other ways women were punished in the past? Share your thoughts below. Please remember to like, comment and share. Subscribe to my channel. See you next time. Adultery, judgment and double standards. A man's affair was forgiven, a woman's was sin. Adulterous women could be cast out, shamed, beaten or killed, depending on law or mood. Proof was not always needed. Sometimes innocent women were punished just for being accused. Appearance, rumor, and timing mattered more than truth. The price of freedom was suspicion, the fear of knowledge. Women who read, healed, or questioned were often distrusted. Intelligence in women was seen as unnatural, useful if contained, dangerous if expressed. A woman who knew too much could lose everything. And so, many hid their learning behind piety, or passed it off as tradition, better to survive than be right. Survival through submission. Many women learned to endure, to lower their gaze, agree softly, obey quickly. They did not believe they were lesser, but they knew they were watched, and that the cost of resistance was real. They hid strength in quiet places, in their children, in their gardens, in their prayers, the power of stories. Stories traveled faster than truth. A woman who said no, a woman who lived alone, a woman who healed without permission. These became legends, twisted, repeated, feared. Women learned to control their own stories when they could, or to erase them entirely, leaving only the work of their hands behind. The shadow of fear. Fear lived in kitchens and convents, markets and manors. Not just of violence, but of reputation, of being seen, misunderstood, punished, and yet women lived. They worked, whispered, resisted, endured. Their strength was not in power, but in persistence. They walked through danger and left behind footprints history tried to erase. In medieval Europe, when a woman married, she lost her name, her family, even her residence. She would take on her husband's last name and live wherever he chose. But a medieval woman wasn't without power. Her influence over her spouse, their relationship and their home could be considerable. But there was one status that could flip the power script entirely. If her husband died, she could become independent, autonomous, and free. This is the history of the powerful widow in medieval Europe. Hello and welcome to the series. Today we are looking at the powerful widow in medieval Europe. Death at the hearth. Death often came early, from war, illness, accident, or age. For many women, widowhood arrived in youth, not old age. A husband might leave for battle and never return, or cough blood in winter and fade before spring. The moment of death changed her status instantly, from wife to widow, from dependent to head of household, from spoken for to watched. What we think of as normal life expectancy today is a modern invention. Medieval people expected death to come in midlife or earlier. Children died young, as did many adults. Pregnancy was dangerous for mothers, and childbirth was risky for babies. Men and women faced down illnesses like tuberculosis, the plague, or leprosy. Injuries from falls or violence proved fatal. And then there was war. While men went off to fight, a wife waited anxiously for their return. If he died, she outlived him. If she died, he survived her. As long as he lived, she was under his authority. But if she outlived him, everything changed. Widows wore black. When a man died, his widow entered a period of mourning. Like other European widows, she dressed in black or dark wool, veiled her hair, and stopped attending dances or feasts. Some did so out of grief, others because the village expected it. It was the socially acceptable thing to do. During mourning, she observed a strict silence, speaking as little as possible, especially about her late husband. Prayer was an important part of the ritual. Day after day, she whispered prayers for the soul of the departed. If she had coin, she purchased masses to be said for him. At home, a candle burned and a name spoken aloud until memory faded. Sometimes a lock of hair or a piece of clothing from the deceased was kept nearby. Superstitions held that the ghost or soul of the husband might use these to manifest. For some, mourning lasted a year and a day. For others, 2 years. And for some, it lasted a lifetime. The length of time varied from place to place and custom to custom. But during this period, The widow neither remarried nor took lovers. After her period of mourning ended, she could move on with her life. She could choose to marry again, to take a lover, or to remain single. The choice was hers. Legal autonomy. At last, widowhood brought something rare: legal identity. Unlike a maiden or wife, a widow could sign contracts, hold land, and represent herself in court. No guardian or male relative stood in for her or acted on her behalf. She was on her own. Now, this didn't mean every widow became an advocate for women's rights. In fact, most women probably never thought of themselves as anything but wives. Even when widowed, they still answered to their husband's family name. And while they had legal autonomy, they usually continued to live according to the expectations of society. Still, the law recognized her as an individual, which gave some women a taste of freedom, a chance to make decisions on her own behalf, to set terms and make bargains, to grow prosperous. As a widow, she could defend her property, raise her children, run a shop, manage a household. A widow might be poor, but she was no longer invisible. Most widows lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture. They owned small farms or plots of land that had belonged to their husband. If a widow could read and write, she could sign documents, and if she couldn't, she made her mark, a cross or initials, beside her name. Her signature, whatever form it took, was legally binding. It was rare, but some widows used their newfound power to challenge local lords. In 1328, a group of Parisian widows took Simon de Montfort to court. He had been rude about their status and the agreement they had reached when their husbands died. One by one, they sued him for slander. Each widow represented herself in court. Each widow won her case. A choice not to marry. A second marriage was expected, especially if she was young and fertile. Men preferred to marry maidens, but if a woman had been through the perils of childbirth, they reasoned, she must be good at it. And the church agreed. Preachers exhorted widows to remarry. Priests and parishioners pressured them. Custom demanded it, but not all women agreed. Some refused to remarry. Others delayed, negotiated, or chose partners on their own terms. Once a widow, she had leverage. She could bargain with prospective suitors, setting terms and seeking financial security for herself and her children. Her first husband's family might have insisted that she marry someone they chose. But now she was free to make her own decision. She could choose a widower with children of his own, a younger man or a much older partner. She could pick a local suitor or someone from far away. In the 18th century, Queen Isabella of France was urged to marry her half-brother King Charles. She refused, insisting on a foreign alliance. Eventually, she wed a man she had met only once before. She was nearly 30, and he was nearly 60. She gained a powerful ally, but she also surrendered her autonomy. Like all widows, she could have chosen to stay single, protecting her children's inheritance and answering to no husband. She could take lovers, though, and many did. Widows who stayed single could face gossip, pressure, and economic strain. There were benefits to remarriage, and most widows eventually chose to do so. Work, commerce, and management. Widows worked. They ran taverns, farms, markets, mills. Their first husband's business passed to them as next of kin. In some towns, guilds allowed a widow to complete the year's work if her husband died before a commission was finished. Then she could collect payment for it. Other widows resumed their husband's trade. Tailoring, tanning, smithing, innkeeping. Some specialized in producing goods for sale like vinegar, soap, candles, wine, or cloth. Widows also produced food, raised animals, and grew crops. They kept their hands busy, making sure their household and family were fed. When her children were old enough, she put them to work. They helped produce goods or ran errands, delivered messages, and collected payments. A son might accompany his mother to market, carrying goods or helping unload a cart. And a daughter might take messages or help with sales. Widows were active in the economy and well suited to managing commerce. They knew how to bargain, when to yield, and whom to trust. Managing a household and surviving alone required skills and smarts. Skills and smarts. Now check out this playlist for more videos on medieval women. And don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Guardianship and motherhood. A widow often became sole guardian of her children. She negotiated marriages, arranged apprenticeships, taught survival. She carried family memory and identity. Her words shaped how the dead were remembered and how the living grew strong. Some sons resisted her, others revered her. Daughters watched her closely, learning what womanhood looked like after loss. Religious refuge and retirement. Older widows sometimes entered convents, not as novices, but as lay sisters or benefactors. There they found quiet, prayer, and rest. Others attached themselves to churches as anchoresses or holy women. A few traveled as pilgrims. Many simply lived alone in cottages tucked near fields or town walls. Solitude became sanctuary. Gossip, threat, and mystery. An independent woman was always suspicious. Who advised her? Who visited? Was she hiding something? Widows were called witches, schemers, or man-haters, especially if they had wealth or refused suitors. Her silence could be read as pride, her decisiveness as danger. Still, many played the role with precision, knowing when to speak and when to let rumor pass unchallenged. The wise woman of the village. With age came respect. The old widow became a counselor, a keeper of recipes, a witness to generations. Her advice was sought, even if not always followed. She remembered names the young had forgotten. She told stories. She prayed for the sick. She buried the dead. And when her own time came, she had already taught others how to grieve. Power in loss. Widowhood was not only absence, it could be presence of wisdom, agency, voice. In the space left by a man's death, a woman could reshape her life. Some did. Quietly, firmly. With the same hands that once rocked cradles and kneaded dough, they wrote ledgers, argued cases, and led households. History rarely names them, but they were there in black veils, with steady eyes and no need to ask permission. This is a story about a door. It's behind me. It was literally closed. Above it, a sign in Latin warned trespassers that they would be put to death, and below it, deadbolts and heavy oak ensured no one pushed through. This door marked the entrance to a schoolroom. Children ran to it at morning, eager for lessons. They loved learning their letters, their numbers, and soon their Latin. But this schoolroom was not for everyone. In medieval Europe, formal education was reserved for boys. Cathedral schools, universities, and grammar training were closed to girls. The door was literal and symbolic. Behind it, books, debate, languages. Outside it, the hands and silence of women. But some women found other doors, cracked open by family, faith, or sheer defiance. They sought knowledge because they were curious, because it was useful, or because its absence made them furious. They traded one kind of silence for another. They swapped gossip at the well for scriptures at their desks, the chatter of hearth and hall for the rustle of pages. They did this at home, in hushed hours and secret places, even inside convents, where the cloistered life was supposed to hold no space for secular learning. Where women were not supposed to be, they were learning. How do we know? Because they left us their work, and now we get to meet two extraordinary women from 800 years ago. Let me introduce you to Hildegard von Bingen, writer, composer, artist, and to the woman whose name we don't know, poet. We have very little information about either of these women. In fact, for most of history, we have very little information about anyone. But what they lacked in known details, they made up for in imagination and drive. Let's start with the woman whose name we don't know. She grew up in a monastery. Her parents made sure she had a good education so that when she entered the convent, she was ready to learn. There, a nun probably taught her Latin, music, and how to write. And those skills are evident in the only thing that survives from her hand, a poem called The Complaint of the Rose. In it, the speaker compares herself to a rose bush growing by a castle wall. From her protected spot, she sees knights ride by, jousting, hunting, fighting. All she has is her voice. She sings of courtly love, of beautiful clothes and jewels, and of a handsome lord whom she will never have. Is this poem a lament for what she'll never have, or is it a celebration of what she does? Both, perhaps. The rosebush can only sing, but it can make itself heard. Hildegard von Bingen was born into a noble family. Her father was a knight. Her mother died when Hildegard was very young, and by the time she was 8, her father sent her to a nearby convent. Like many noble girls, Hildegard's education started at home. A member of her family might have tutored her, as was common among elite families. When she entered the convent, a formal teacher took over. As a teenager, Hildegard distinguished herself as a brilliant student, and her teachers trusted her with more and more responsibility. Soon, she was helping instruct younger girls. At 14, she was given the position of abbess. She led the convent for the next 70 years. During that time, she received regular visits from bishops and theologians who came to ask her questions about faith. Those meetings inspired her first book, a collection of theological visions. It was illustrated with detailed drawings that she made herself. That same year, she was visited by an official from the church who wanted to know if he should allow Hildegard to continue receiving guests. His report included this remarkable line about her education. She had been carefully instructed in divine and human things. Divine and human things. What did he mean by that? Well, during her lifetime, people recognized that she knew a great deal. She was consulted on matters of church policy and visited by royalty. She composed masses and other sacred music, and she continued to draw and write until her eyesight failed her. Hildegard's story suggests that there were many people willing to open doors for her, but she kicked them open herself. And drew him a picture of a book with these words coming from it. What is a book? It is the voice of truth. Those words have always inspired me, but now I hear them in a new way. Books are more than just voices. They're doors. They can lead us to new worlds and new ways of thinking. If we find them difficult to open, we can break down the walls. We can chip away at stone with our imaginations. We can leave the familiar hearth for the unknown world of ideas. Of course, that wasn't easy for women in the Middle Ages. If they were caught learning, they could be punished. For men, literacy was associated with power, and that power came with control. Women were not supposed to wield that power. If they did, they risked upsetting the entire structure. For all the doors that were open to Hildegard and the unnamed poet, countless others remained closed. They couldn't take their rightful place at the table of scholars, but they still craved knowledge. So they slipped inside anyway, bringing their own light. Wherever they were, they used what they had to keep learning. Today, we look back at this period, and we tend to think of the Middle Ages as dark and superstitious. We call it the Dark Ages. But women found light in unexpected places. They turned darkness into art. They turned silence into song. And now their work lights our way. When I became a professor, I inherited boxes of old chalkboards. These were mine. I brought them home, and then I couldn't figure out what to do with them. They reminded me of my students, of lectures past, of conversations that once felt urgent but no longer did. One day, I brought them to an artist friend of mine. He looked at them and said, "You should cut these up and use them as canvases." And that's what I did. And now, each time I see those paintings, I remember why I became a professor and how lucky I was to have one when I went to university. Thank you. Hildegard, Julian, and the named few, a handful broke through. Hildegard of Bingen composed music, wrote theology, and advised kings. Julian of Norwich recorded visions in mystical prose. Christine de Pizan defended women with elegant arguments. They were exceptions, but also inspiration. Their names shone in a world that kept most women anonymous. Practical knowledge. Even without books, most women were deeply educated in what mattered. Childbirth, brewing, bartering, gardening, midwifery, nursing, spinning. They could calculate weights, memorize recipes, forecast weather, and recite ancestral lines. They read faces, heard tone, remembered debts. They learned through living and remembered everything, forbidden books and silent readers. Some women read books they were told not to. Romances, saints' lives, herbal treatises. They borrowed from priests, copied from brothers, or read aloud in groups of trusted friends. To read was power. To write was rebellion. Many risked both. A hidden book under a mattress could be as thrilling and as dangerous as any sword. Teaching others. Learned women became teachers. Mothers taught daughters. Midwives trained apprentices. Nuns raised orphans. Herbalists passed down secrets, plant by plant. Even the illiterate taught through rhythm, memory, song. Knowledge moved through generations like water over stone. Slow, persistent, reshaping what it touched. Quiet light. In a dark room. Education for women was rare, but not extinct. It lived in songs, symbols, recipes, and prayers. It whispered in stitched letters and ink-stained fingers. A woman who learned and taught, changed the world in ways no chronicle recorded. Her legacy was not in libraries, but in lives. I don't know if this story would have been possible to tell in a book. It took me 5 years to write. It contains material that my editors thought too much for some readers to stomach. And even now, telling it feels like pushing against a dam. Which is why I want you to hear this first. This story is a love letter to all the women in my life, and to all those who have loved and lost and held each other up when the world wanted to bring us down. It is dedicated to my mother, whose hands are strong and gentle, and to my sister, who listens and understands without words. In the world where marriages were arranged, speech was policed, and solitude was rare, friendship between women became a lifeline. These were not just passing acquaintances. They were alliances. They were built over laundry basins at the market stall, during shared prayer or whispered confessions in candlelight. Where the world looked past them, they looked at each other. They say we remember our first loves best, and I recall mine vividly. Her name was Selma, and her house smelled of figs and secrets. We were 8 summers old, and I had been sent to fetch water. When I returned, dripping and breathless, she'd already dipped her cloth in the cool stream, tied back her unruly hair, and spread her skirt on the ground as a blanket. Then she did something that changed my life. She smiled and said, "Come sit." I spent that afternoon in a daze. I learned that day that not all silences were shameful, that some could be companionable. When my family came to collect me, my mother asked, "Who spoke first?" I shook my head, unable to answer, and Mother only sighed and squeezed my shoulder before she led me home. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay with Selma and her wide, knowing smile. But Mother knew these visits could be dangerous. For while children's games might seem innocent, there are things parents fear their daughters learning too soon. Certain looks too bright, certain words too sharp, and certain dreams too wild. Still, Selma and I met in secret. We crept into gardens, sat in haylofts, and scaled the tallest trees. My legs still bear the scars of those adventures, scrapes and scratches that marked my passage into womanhood. It was Selma who helped me navigate that treacherous journey, and yet it wasn't enough, not really. I yearned for more, for a different life, for books, for knowledge, for stories beyond our village. When I left, I carried my grief like a stone in my chest. I knew not everyone would be so lucky. My friends, especially the clever ones, would be married off one by one until their laughter echoed only in my memory. And that ache, that ache turned into ink. This story is a testament to them, to the ones who dreamed of bigger things, and to those who held their dreams in their mouths without ever letting them escape. When I think of female friendship, I think of 18th century France. A man once wrote to his friend describing a visit he paid to a family in Paris and the scene that greeted him. The young woman had just returned from a walk with her two female companions. Upon seeing her brother, she dropped her fan and ran to greet him. One of her companions did the same. The other remained seated. The man noticed this and asked why she hadn't joined the others, and she replied simply, "Because I am not her sister." Think about that for a second. Even today, we assume that families are nuclear, that it's the parents and children who have the closest bond. But in many cultures, the ties between sisters are just as important, and sometimes even stronger. It's hard to overstate the importance of sisterhood. In many countries, the decision to marry was often taken out of a woman's hands. And when she wed, she wouldn't necessarily move in with her husband, but instead he would join her family home. That meant her relationships with her sisters, aunts, and female cousins would continue to be vitally important, even after marriage. What did these relationships look like? Well, imagine the everyday. Making clothes, preparing food, sharing gossip, soothing arguments, but also picture significant occasions, weddings and funerals. Perhaps a sister helping to whiles away the time before her sister's wedding, braiding her hair, tying her shoes, helping her choose her dress. Then afterwards, dancing with her new husband at the reception, then returning home, exhausted and happy, and talking into the night about everything they saw. There's an incredible painting called The First Class by French artist Georges de la Tour. It shows two sisters getting ready for an outing. One is kneeling, helping the other put on her stockings. And it's so tender and moving. I think of it every time I see my own sister. Sometimes it can feel like a burden, being a sibling. So much is expected of you, you're related, you share DNA, a history, but what if it was the opposite? What if being a sister was a choice? If you chose to call someone your sister, what does that mean? How would you behave towards one another? In her novel, The House of Spirits, Isabel Allende writes, "Women who love each other are like branches that support each other. They grow, they bend, and they break together. As a girl, I would have disagreed. I grew up believing that only mothers had the right to love their daughters. Fathers didn't show affection. Men couldn't handle feelings. At least that's what I thought until my mother died. After her funeral, I retreated to my room and locked the door. I must have spent hours curled up on my bed. And then a knock, very light, very hesitant. When I opened the door, it was my father. He was holding my baby sister's hand, and when he looked at me, I saw tears. He stepped forward and wrapped me in the tightest hug. Then he walked away again, leaving me speechless. That moment cracked my world open and allowed me to see the strength in my father, the gentleness in my sister. I realized that love didn't have to be expressed in a certain way. It didn't need words. All this time I had been looking for love in all the wrong places. The bonds between women weren't just limited to those related by blood. In convents, for example, a nun might spend decades with the same women, sharing everything from their meals to their prayers to their beds. Nuns made their own clothes and wove themselves baskets to store their few possessions in, but they also wove images into those baskets, pictures of saints, biblical scenes, flowers. They created objects d'art, and they hid their own faces in plain sight. There are hundreds of self-portraits by nuns. They show solemn eyes gazing out or hands clasped in prayer. But often those hands are gnarled and twisted, betraying the age of the artist. This isn't surprising because the subject matter was usually quite literally all they had to occupy their thoughts. A nun's work was her only solace. In the 17th century, Margaret Fell wrote a poem about her experiences as a woman and as a member of the religious Society of Friends. In it, she describes how she would often read the scriptures with other women. They would come together, and although they could not speak their minds freely amongst men, when alone they could talk and question and learn. She writes, "And thus, in silence, we would spend the day, in silent contemplation of the divine presence, heavenly thoughts, deep meditations, and holy desires. Oh, how sweet it was to me." In recent history, one of the most famous groups of female friends was the Coven of Witches in Salem. Accused of consorting with the devil and practicing dark magic, they were arrested and imprisoned. Reverend Samuel Parris, who started the whole witch hunt, wanted nothing more than to separate them. Yet they managed to send messages through a system of taps and knocks, as well as written notes passed secretly under their skirts. Here's a saying I heard growing up: "A friend is a second wind behind you when your own has failed." I think that's true in a literal sense too. Have you ever noticed how when you run out of breath, you naturally start breathing through your mouth? This is actually what your body does when it's low on oxygen. But you can train yourself to breathe differently. Just as a reminder, I'm not a medical professional, so please consult your doctor before trying any of this. But from what I've read, breathing through your mouth forces your body to take in more oxygen. Inhaling through your nose, on the other hand, helps calm your nervous system and lowers your blood pressure. Inhaling through your mouth will speed up your heart rate, while breathing in through your nostrils relaxes your muscles and makes you less anxious. I like to think that breathing through my nose and remembering to slow myself down allows me to listen to the people around me better, to hear their unspoken words, and to respond rather than react. Here's what I've learned from women. There's power in numbers, in sisterhood, in choosing your own family. There's safety in it. There's strength too. But above all, there is kindness. Think about the women you know, the ones who've supported you, challenged you, the ones you couldn't do without. How would you describe them? Do they have calloused hands or painted fingernails? Did they teach you how to read or write? Or did they tell you stories about fairies and witches and stepmothers who turn into ogres? Maybe they only appear in your dreams. To me, they are all heroines, and I hope this story gave voice to just a few of them. Mourning together. When a child died, it was other women who held the grieving mother. When a husband fell in battle, it was women who helped dress the widow. They showed up with food, quiet company, and long memory. In mourning, they braided each other's hair, bathed the dead, lit candles side by side. Grief shared became less cruel. Jealousy, betrayal, and repair. Not all friendships held. Gossip could wound, envy could grow. Trust, once broken, might never return. But even so, women often found their way back to each other. There was too much at stake. They lived among judgment. But among each other, there was still room for healing. Love that dared not speak. Some female bonds passed quietly into love. In convents or private homes, women wrote each other letters, composed songs, exchanged small gifts, shared beds for warmth and comfort, and more. These loves were seldom recorded, or when they were rewritten as deep friendship. But within, there was affection as rich as any marriage, perhaps richer. Passing. It on, older women taught younger ones how to endure, how to fold dough properly, how to wrap a wound, how to hide a bruise, how to stay silent or when not to. Knowledge passed from friend to friend, from sister to sister, from stranger to stranger, soft as breath, steady as lineage. The unseen weave. While history wrote down the names of kings, battles, and popes, women wove a different story through each other. They watched over one another's children, finished one another's sentences, held one another up. Together, they stitched a tapestry no historian could name, but every woman could feel. That is the sisterhood that never vanished. Toil, work, duty, service, silence, submission. For most of the year, a medieval woman's life was repetition. The same chores, the same quiet duties, the same men telling her what to do. But the calendar held its bright spaces. Feast days, holy festivals, village fairs, brief moments where the rules loosened and joy was permitted. Even the poorest woman looked forward to them. For one day the bread might be sweet, the air full of music, and her time, her own. Hi everyone, welcome to this house. Today we are celebrating the clothing women wore during the Middle Ages, but not just any clothing. We are focusing on the garments they donned on feast days and holidays. If you enjoy learning about historical fashion through my videos, please subscribe so you never miss an upload. Women made these celebrations possible. They brewed ale, baked honey cakes, embroidered linens for the church altar, and cleaned the house from floor to beam. Preparation took days, but it was done with a kind of anticipation, even pride. A clean apron, a bright ribbon, a bit of rouge from crushed berries, these became small rituals of transformation. In many ways, a medieval woman's life revolved around the domestic sphere. Her clothing often reflected her station, marital status, and age. While feast days offered a temporary reprieve from the confines of daily life, her clothing still served as a visual identifier of her place in society. However, these special garments also symbolized hope, faith, and the feminine mystique that had been largely suppressed during the rest of the year. For example, a white head covering was a symbol of female piety. During the weekdays, a woman would cover her hair with a simple linen or woolen veil, but on feast days, she might don a fancier one. A widow might wear a black veil as a sign of her mourning, but for a festival, she could exchange it for a colorful one. A young girl who had not yet been married might wear a red or blue veil as a symbol of her virginity. However, once she was wed, she would often be expected to wear a white veil as a symbol of her new role as a wife. In essence, the color of a woman's head covering could change depending on the occasion, offering a glimpse into her identity beyond her everyday life. Dance, laughter, and the open square. On festival days, women danced, sometimes in circles, sometimes with men, sometimes with other women, skirts flying, hair loosened. They laughed aloud, played games, competed in riddles, watched jugglers or mimes. For a few hours they were not wives or widows, servants or nuns. They were simply people living. And when music played, they remembered themselves. During the medieval period, dancing was not merely a pastime, but a deeply ingrained part of community life. It was a way to express oneself, to connect with others, and to celebrate important occasions. Men and women of all social classes participated in dances, which were often performed in public squares or during festivals. For women, dancing was a chance to break free from the constraints of their everyday lives. They could let loose, have fun, and even flirt with the men of their choice. This freedom was especially cherished on feast days and holidays, when the rigid social norms of everyday life were relaxed. Moreover, dancing was a communal activity that brought people together. It was a way to strengthen bonds within the community and to reinforce a sense of belonging. The dances themselves were varied and lively, often incorporating elements of folk traditions and local customs. From the lively reels and jigs of Ireland to the graceful waltzes of France, there was a dance for every occasion. The clothing of celebration. A woman might wear her best wool dress, her only lace-trimmed veil, a necklace passed down from her grandmother. She might trade or borrow just to have something beautiful for the feast. These were not just clothes, they were declarations. I am here. I belong. I am more than my labor. On special occasions, women would don their finest garments, which often differed significantly from their everyday attire. These garments were not just clothes. They were a form of self-expression, a way to enhance one's beauty and proclaim one's presence. For instance, a woman might wear her finest gown, perhaps one made of rich materials like velvet or silk, and adorned with intricate embroidery or lace. Such a gown would have been reserved for special occasions and would have been a symbol of her status and wealth. Additionally, a woman might have worn a decorative headdress or a colorful veil to complement her outfit, further emphasizing her femininity and adding a touch of elegance. These garments were not merely meant to be beautiful, they were also a way to convey a message. By wearing such fine clothing, a woman was making a statement about her importance within the community. It was a way to show that she was more than just a housewife or a laborer. She was a valued member of society whose contributions and presence should be acknowledged and celebrated. So on feast days, while the clothes remained symbolic markers of a woman's place in society, they also became canvases for personal expression and affirmations of identity. Through the colors, fabrics, and styles they chose to wear, medieval women were able to showcase their individuality and assert their presence in a world that often tried to diminish it. Sacred time and the female voice. Feast days often involved song, and women's voices were part of the music. They sang hymns in church, carols in the street, and lullabies by candlelight. Some composed, some led choirs, some simply hummed along. In these moments, their voices were not only allowed, they were essential. Medieval society had a rich musical heritage, and women played an active role in its performance. They participated in various musical activities, including singing in church choirs, performing at courtly gatherings, and even composing music. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that the extent of a woman's participation in music varied greatly depending on her social class and marital status. For instance, upper-class women who enjoyed greater freedom and access to education were more likely to receive musical training and to perform in public. They might have also had the means to acquire and maintain instruments, allowing them to compose and conduct music. On the other hand, peasant women who faced more restrictions and had different priorities might have engaged in music primarily for domestic purposes. They may have sung while working or at social gatherings within their community. Regardless of their social class, women's voices were integral to the musical landscape of the Middle Ages. They contributed to the beauty and richness of sacred and secular music, creating an atmosphere of harmony and cultural vibrancy. Feast days, festivals, and fairs were times when the everyday constraints on women's lives eased. They could dance, sing, dress in their finest clothes, and even play certain instruments. It was a time for merriment, community, and a break from the monotony of routine. Women looked forward to these days as an opportunity to express themselves and be part of the shared joy. During these times, a woman might wear her best dress, the one she only wore for special occasions. Her veil might be more elaborate than usual, and her hair would be adorned with ribbons or flowers. She could put on a bit of rouge or lip balm made from berries to add a touch of color to her face. These clothes and accessories were not just garments. They were symbols of her identity, her status, and her femininity. They were a way for her to express herself and be part of the festive atmosphere. These moments of celebration were not just about individual expression. They were also about community and togetherness. Women participated in group dances with other females or with both men and women. They sang carols or other songs, sometimes even composing their own. Their voices blended together, creating a harmonious soundscape that filled the air. The music and singing were not just a form of entertainment. They were a way to connect with others, to build bonds, and to share in the joy of the celebration. While feast days and festivals provided a welcome respite from the constraints of everyday life, it's essential to remember that medieval women's experiences were shaped by broader social norms and restrictions. Their clothing and behavior, even during celebrations, were often guided by societal expectations and gender roles. Nonetheless, these occasions offered valuable glimpses into the lives of medieval women. They provide a window into a world where they could momentarily set aside the burdens of their daily routines and embrace the freedoms and joys of music, dance, and community. What are your favorite things about medieval women's clothing? Do you have a piece of clothing that makes you feel like dancing? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. Please remember to support our channel. We'll see you next time. Romances and meetings, fairs and festivals were times of courtship. Glances exchanged, hands brushed, promises whispered beneath lanterns. For many young women, it was the only chance to meet someone beyond family or village. Stories began on these nights, some sweet, others sorrowful. But even for the married and the tired, the flirtation of the evening could stir something long buried. Food, wine, and rest. There was meat on the table, honey in the stew, ale in every jug. For one day, hunger gave way to indulgence. Women who cooked for others all year could sit, eat, and taste joy. Full bellies meant laughter came easier. Sleep that night was heavy, contented. Rituals for the turning year, midsummer fires, winter solstice candles, spring garlands, autumn harvest songs. Women led these quiet rituals. They carried greenery to the well, lit the year's first flame, braided wheat into symbols of luck. These were acts older than churches, acts of grounding and celebration, mischief and reversal. On some days, social roles flipped. Servants mocked their masters, wives teased their husbands. In carnivals and mystery plays, women played fools or queens. The festival made space for subversion, and in laughter, a kind of truth was spoken, if only for a day. The morning after. When the festival ended, the bells rang as usual. The skirts were rehemmed, the pots were scrubbed, the veil was folded away. But something lingered, a story told, a song remembered, a smile shared. These glimmers were fuel for the long days ahead. Joy, however brief, was never wasted. The medieval period is often referred to as a dark age. While there are valid reasons for this, many historians have begun to challenge the idea that it was completely without light. One way to learn about medieval life is to read primary sources written during the period. However, when we read them, we notice something interesting. The vast majority of them were written by men. There are a few exceptions which can give us unique insight into how women experienced the Middle Ages. In addition, a few historians and chroniclers of the time did take note of the women they encountered. Thus, while we will never know the thoughts of the average medieval woman who likely died without so much as a name recorded, we can find glimpses of the lives of some of those whose paths intersected with those of men who thought their stories worth recording. As we begin, let's set our expectations. We will not meet any queens today, though queens were fascinating figures in medieval history. We will leave Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of France for another day. These women wielded great power and sometimes even performed acts of violence. Though we will be meeting women like them in future videos, this time we want to consider the everyday experiences of medieval women. So, with that in mind, let's explore the ways medieval women made their mark on the world around them. No names on statues. Most medieval women died without ever being named in a chronicle, without their faces carved in stone or their thoughts written in ink. History often passed them by, not because they were silent, but because no one wrote down what they said. And yet they left legacies behind, woven into kitchens, chapels, stories, and descendants. Hands that built and fed. They built homes, not with hammer and chisel, but with constant hands, spinning, weaving, mending, lighting fires, kneading dough. Every wall that stood through winter had a woman's hand behind it. Every feast had her recipe. Every soldier had her lullaby in memory, even if he forgot her name. Stories passed by hearthlight. Women told stories at the edge of sleep, folk tales, St. Liv's family legends. They passed on history that never entered books, only hearts. They warned through fairy tales, advised through parables, and remembered what men forgot. Their words traveled farther than they knew. Songs without composers. From convents to kitchens, women sang. Work songs, wedding laments, cradle songs. Anonymous but unforgettable. Even now, echoes of medieval melodies survive, passed from mother to child, village to village. No one knows who wrote them, but they remain. Gardens that healed and taught women, planted seeds they never saw bloom. Herb gardens that healed generations, roses and rue that taught daughters which leaves to trust. Even today, some folk remedies, perfumes, or recipes trace back to nameless women who learned by watching and remembering. These 4 poems were written by an author who goes by the pen name T. Kingfisher. The poems come from a collection called The Narrow House and are included here for a reason. First of all, they reflect the way many people experience medieval history. We tend to focus on the accomplishments of kings and queens, dukes and archbishops, and everyone else fades into the background. But as these poems remind us, the world of the Middle Ages was shaped by the work of countless ordinary people whose names were never recorded, especially women. These poems also show us that despite the lack of opportunities open to women in the medieval period, they still accomplished impressive things. Through their cooking, healing, storytelling, and even singing, medieval women created a culture that has survived to the present day. We want to continue exploring that culture in this series. Keep watching to learn more about the lives of some remarkable medieval women whose accomplishments were recorded by the men around them. Before we go any further, however, please remember to click the subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. The first woman we will meet lived in the 12th century. Her story comes to us through 2 chronicles written by monks. Her name was Matilda of Boulogne, and she was the wife of King Henry II of England. When Henry came to power, Matilda was a wealthy heiress whose family could benefit him by making powerful connections. Thus the marriage was a strategic one, and it seems to have been generally happy. Henry frequently went on crusade or to Normandy to manage his duchy there, leaving Matilda to govern England in his stead. She was not a passive figurehead, but took an active role in politics, though she was often criticized for her outspoken nature. This caused some problems for Matilda, as the monks who wrote about her make clear. For example, when Henry was preparing to marry the daughter of the King of France, a necessary diplomatic step to secure the border between his lands and hers, Matilda tried to talk him out of it. She pointed out that his new wife would be a rival to his queen, and that proved to be true. After Henry and Isabella of Angoulême married, Matilda plotted with her son, the future King John, to get rid of the new queen. The monks who recorded these events certainly didn't approve of Matilda's actions, but they noted her intelligence and political acumen nonetheless. She even attended royal courts and sometimes acted as regent when her husband was abroad. Unfortunately, Matilda's story does not survive because of any literary achievements or significant personal projects of hers. Rather, she appears as a supporting character in the works of chroniclers like John of Worcester, who wrote about her criticisms of Henry's second marriage, or the chronicler of the Abbey of St. Albans, who records her regency during Henry's absence. Still, for a woman of the medieval period, especially one born in a minor noble family, her story is remarkable. She rose to become the most powerful queen consort in England, known for her intelligence and willingness to speak her mind, even if that meant ruffling the feathers of powerful nobles and churchmen. Our next subject lived a very different kind of life, but like Matilda, she was also famous for her sharp tongue. Her name was Margaret Kemys, and she was a Welsh woman who lived in the late 13th century. Like many rural women of her time, Margaret's life revolved around her farm and her livestock. But unlike many other women, she seems to have owned her land outright. In 1294, she sold part of her property to a local lord, paying him 40 shillings for a quitclaim to 2 ox gangs of land. An ox gang was the amount of land a team of oxen could plough in a year, and thus was a common unit of measurement. So while we don't know exactly how much Margaret's farm produced, we do know that she was independent enough to own land worth at least 2 ox gangs. Another record from the following year shows that Margaret and her neighbours brought their cheeses to be weighed in preparation for sale at a market. But when one of her neighbours complained that her cheese had been incorrectly weighed, Margaret responded with an insult that the chronicler of the incident couldn't resist recording. When he asked her about the discrepancy in weights, she said, "By the rood, my arse, let him get himself unbuttoned." Needless to say, the chronicler found this colourful language quite amusing. While we don't know anything about Margaret except what we can learn from her sharp retort, it's clear that she was a self-sufficient landowner who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. Medieval women weren't just accomplishing things in the secular world. Some were also important contributors to the religious life of their communities. In fact, some nuns and abbesses played major roles in preserving literature and scholarship, even during a period often associated with the decline of learning. One such woman was Christina of Markyate, who lived in the late 11th century. She was born into a wealthy family in England, but after her father died, she and her mother had to flee to the Abbey of Markyate after her uncle tried to force her mother to remarry. At the Abbey, Christina became a nun, eventually rising to the position of abbess. Despite the lack of formal education for women at the time, Christina became well versed in many subjects and was even called upon to settle theological debates. During her career, she also wrote several letters on topics ranging from ethics to spirituality. She was even consulted by 2 archbishops of Canterbury regarding the reform of the church. It was a dangerous calling, and Christina paid the price for her boldness. She was falsely accused of simony, which is the practice of buying and selling church offices, and was stripped of her position as abbess. Later cleared of the charges against her, Christina spent the last years of her life writing, compiling a collection of biblical and classical texts, and translating works from Latin into English. She was clearly a woman of great intellect, and her writings demonstrate her knowledge of scripture and classical literature. But she was also brave enough to speak her mind in a man's world. For this reason, Christina of Markyate remains an important figure in the history of medieval women, as well as the history of literature and education. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss an exciting episode. And as always, stay tuned for more information. Daughters who remembered their children were the greatest record they left, taught to survive, to pray, to carry memory forward. Even when sons went to war or court, it was daughters who remembered the woman behind the home. A way of folding linen, a prayer in danger, a whispered warning, all hers. Quiet acts of defiance. Not all legacy is softness. Some women resisted, refused to marry, took in the outcast, taught forbidden things, hid heresy in drawers, gave birth in secret, buried what the world wanted forgotten. These women changed history from the edges, quietly, fiercely, graves without stones. Most were buried without inscription, no cross, no epitaph, just earth and time. But someone had loved them once. Someone knew the tilt of their head, the sound of their sigh, and in the breath of those who came after, something of them remained. The unwritten book. If medieval women had written their own history, what would they have said? Not only of hardship, but of humor. Not only suffering, but wisdom, longings, triumphs, questions, songs. The book was never written, but parts survive, stitched into embroidery, layered into bread, hidden in songs still sung. The enduring thread. They left no empire, no armies, no thrones, but they left warmth where there had been cold, knowledge where there had been pain, strength where there had been fear. Their legacy is not found in cathedrals, but in every woman who endures, creates, heals, remembers. When I was young, history was a story about men. Kings and queens, conquerors and crusaders, poets and painters, scientists and saints. I knew their names, their accomplishments, their portraits, and when I came across their female relatives, mothers, wives and sisters, they seemed flat and lifeless, like cutouts made from paper. There wasn't much to say about them, except that they were related to famous men. They lived in the shadow of their husbands, fathers or brothers. And as I grew up, I went to university and I studied medieval history and art history. I learned more about women. I learned their names. But still, there was something missing. I wanted to know more about their daily life, their worries and their hopes, their laughter and their dreams. And then I thought maybe we can't know those things. Maybe they're lost forever. But I was wrong. Because centuries have passed, the world has changed beyond what any medieval woman could have imagined. And yet we still ask, who were they really? What did they think? What did they dream? To remember them is not just to uncover names or places, but to restore presence, to let their quiet lives speak, even now. Medieval history, which is the study of the Middle Ages, has long focused on kings, wars, and power. Women's work was unseen, their faith unnoticed, their pain dismissed. Their voices, if recorded at all, were filtered through the hands of men. How do we hear them now? Today, new eyes read old texts. New scholars listen between the lines. New hearts feel that silence and begin to fill it. Here in England, women's voices are emerging from the pages of historical records. And I've been so excited to learn about some of the women who lived right here. Here are 5 ways we're finding their traces. Number 1, looking for their signatures on documents. Medieval legal documents often list witnesses to a contract or an agreement. Sometimes they would put their marks instead of their names. And for most of history, women couldn't own property in their own right. So they rarely signed documents as individuals. But they often appear in legal contexts as daughters, wives, or widows. And if they were noble women, they might sign with a flourish. And I love looking for their signatures because each one is unique and tells us something about their identity. Number 2, peering into their prayer books. Religious women are often remembered through their piety and their prayers. And while many of their prayers were written by male theologians, these women used books of hours to pray privately. Books of hours were filled with psalms, saints' lives, and instructions on how to live a godly life. And inside the covers, someone real prayed. Underneath the exquisite art, there's the trace of a hand that turned the page, that underlined a favorite verse, that lingered over an illustration. And sometimes these books had blank spaces for the owner to write notes or prayers of their own. And I love these personal touches because they remind me that underneath all the rules and regulations of the medieval church, there was a real person praying for her own reasons. Number 3, listening to what they wrote in the margins. While women couldn't always own books, they could own manuscripts. That means that throughout the Middle Ages, there were tons of people copying texts who were women. These women might have copied a manuscript for their own amusement, to pass the time while they were spinning or weaving. Or they might have been paid to copy a text for someone else. And sometimes they left little doodles or marginalia or notes for the next scribe. And this kind of stuff isn't very useful historically, but it's incredibly valuable for understanding how women experienced the texts they were reading or copying. Number 4, uncovering their wills. Wills reveal a lot about a person's life, like their family and their property. And while most of the wills we have from medieval England were made by men, there were plenty of women leaving instructions for what should happen after they died. Most women couldn't own property in their own right, so their wills mostly dealt with property owned by their husband or father. Often a wife couldn't dispose of her husband's property without his consent, but she might be able to arrange for the care of her children. A will shows us what was important to her, like caring for her family or donating to a particular church. And as you read through a will, you get a sense of a particular place and time. You see who were the important people in her life and what role she played in her community. Nomen. 5. Reading letters addressed to them. Letters are a direct line to the past. They're someone talking to someone else about something that mattered, and while most letters mentioning women were written by men, there were also plenty of letters written to women, especially royal women. They received missives from across the kingdom, from lords detailing events in their region, or thanking them for a gift or inviting them to visit. And this trail of letters gives us insight into how women participated in politics and culture. There's no single story that explains medieval women's lives because their experiences depended on their social class, their age, their location, and most of all, who was telling their story. But over the last 100 years, feminist historians have uncovered countless stories of women's lives in the Middle Ages. And they've helped me to see that the past wasn't just a story about men. It was also a story about women. I'm standing in a space that remembers 1,000 years of history. Right behind me is the choir of the Abbey Church, and above me is the roof boss that remembers a woman's face. And my favorite thing about being a guide here is sharing these stories of the past with visitors. When I tell the story of the Black Death, I don't just talk about the plague, I talk about how it affected people's daily lives. And when I walk visitors through the cloisters, I point out where the women's choir would have sat, and I encourage everyone to look at the details of their carvings. And when we visit the tomb of King Edward the Confessor, I always tell the story of Queen Edith, who outlived him by 26 years. For most of history, the great cathedrals like this one were built by men and for men. And yet right here, tucked in the corner, there's the memory of a woman, the mother of a king. And I love this carving because she reminds me that every building tells many stories. We remember them in museums. Artifacts are rare. Most of the things medieval women used every day were made of perishable materials like wood or fabric or leather. So few objects survived. When they did survive, they were often displayed as curiosities, not as fragments of a life well lived. But today, when objects are displayed in museums, curators take a more holistic view of history. They don't just focus on big-ticket items like jewelry or clothing worn by the elite. They also consider everyday items like combs and rings and prayer books. And we find them in museums all around the country, and sometimes these objects come home to places like this. The British Museum recently returned a comb to the Abbey. This comb was probably carved by a woman living in a monastery around 1300. Like many objects, it was broken when it entered the collection. But its discovery allowed researchers to learn about the technique and tools used by medieval craftswomen. And once it was repaired, it returned to the place where it was made. The past isn't gone. It's layered beneath the present, like cloth beneath embroidery. And it's easy to dismiss medieval women as unimportant. After all, most of their accomplishments didn't make it into history books. But as more and more scholars uncover their voices, we remember that they were real people who accomplished real things. And they deserve to be remembered. What do you want to uncover next? What questions do you have about the past? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. And until next time, keep asking questions, reclaiming the invisible. To tell the story of medieval women is not to romanticize hardship, but to recognize resilience. Their silence was not absence, it was adaptation. Their submission, often strategy. Their suffering, never the whole story. Reclaiming them means allowing complexity and listening for nuance, the echo in modern lives. Even now, echoes linger. In the mother teaching her daughter to braid hair, in the healer tending herbs in a windowsill, in the grandmother who remembers stories no one else can tell. The legacy of medieval women is not just past, it is practice, continued in gesture, care, and courage. Why we remember? We remember not because they were perfect, but because they were human. And because humanity deserves remembrance, no matter how hidden, ordinary, or unnamed. They remind us that value is not always loud, that survival can be grace, that endurance is a form of art. The story still unfolding. There are more names to find, more songs to unearth, more recipes, letters, and memories still waiting. Each time someone reads, listens, or wonders, they continue the work. The story grows, the silence breaks, a candle in the quiet. So now, as the hour deepens and the voices grow still, we remember them, not as relics, but as women, with hands that shaped bread and history, with hearts that carried grief and laughter, with dreams that stretched beyond stone walls. They were here, and now they are heard.